warrior's blood demanding action while her loyalty to the fragile alliance of hearts forced her to remain, her presence a shield for the very woman enemies sought to turn against her. He saw Manhattan moving through the corridors like a general whose battlefield was stone and whisper, her voice calm as she questioned servants and sealed doors, her hand steady even as she carried the burden of protecting the realm's beating heart from poisons both literal and spoken. The memory of their clasped hands, Nilufer and Asportia standing together in the lamplight, lingered in him like a prayer he dared not speak aloud, for to name it was to risk inviting the very fate that sought to shatter it. The forest gave way to open fields where shepherds watched their flocks with wary eyes, and Orhan's small force passed through villages where smoke rose from chimneys and children paused in their play to stare at the riders whose faces spoke of distant wars. In one such village, an old man stepped forward with bread and salt, his voice trembling as he asked if the Sultan had come to bring peace or to take sons for the next battle. Orhan dismounted and accepted the offering, his reply low and measured, telling the elder that peace was the prize they all chased, but that the path to it ran through blood and steel, that every man who rode with him did so knowing the cost. The old man nodded, his eyes clouded with the wisdom of one who had seen too many sultans pass, and he whispered a blessing that the wind might carry Orhan farther than the knives of his enemies. They rode on, the bread shared among the men, the taste of it simple and grounding, a reminder that beyond the maps and the strategies lay the lives of those who tilled the soil and waited for sons who might never return. As the land sloped toward the coast, the air grew sharp with salt, and the sound of waves reached them long before the sea itself appeared, a low roar that spoke of vast distances and hidden dangers beneath the surface. They reached the hidden cove where their vessels waited, small, swift galleys painted in colors that blended with the night, their sails furled, their crews already loading the last of the supplies under the cover of dusk. The crossing to Samandaria would be swift and silent, a knife slipped between ribs rather than a hammer swung at a gate, and Orhan gathered his commanders on the shore as the first stars pricked the darkening sky. Tarhin spoke of the landing points, of the rocky beaches where their boats could slip ashore unseen if the moon stayed hidden, of the paths that wound upward through cliffs where a single misstep meant death in the surf below. Shamal traced routes on a scrap of parchment by the light of a shielded lantern, marking the outer walls of the basilica where Andreas held court, the guard rotations that Abrenos's spies had bought with gold and promises, the narrow service corridors where a small force could move like smoke if they struck at the hour when the fortress slept deepest. Orhan listened, his gaze fixed on the black water, and he added the layer that turned strategy into something sharper. They would not strike the main gates, he said, for that was the path of fools who sought glory in open battle. Instead they would land under cover of darkness, scale the lesser cliffs where the rocks jutted like broken teeth, and enter through the old drainage tunnels that the sea had carved beneath the fortress over centuries. Once inside, they would split into 3 groups, Tarhin taking the western corridors to secure the armory and prevent reinforcements, Shamal moving to the central hall where Andreas was known to hold his late-night councils, and Orhan himself leading the strike on the inner chambers where Shahanshah was said to brood over maps and ambitions. The goal was not slaughter but capture, he reminded them, for a dead Andreas was a martyr whose ghost would rally the emperor's forces, but a living Andreas bound and brought before the light could unravel the web of lies that stretched from Constantinople to the heart of Bursa. If Palladios appeared, and Orhan's voice hardened at the name, they were to take him alive if possible, for his tongue held the names of every traitor who walked the palace floors and every agent who poisoned the wells of trust. The men nodded, their eyes reflecting the lantern's flame, and they boarded the galleys as the tide began to turn. The sea took them with a cold embrace, the oars dipping in rhythm that matched the beating of Orhan's heart, the spray rising like cold fingers against their faces as the land fell away behind them. Night deepened into a velvet darkness broken only by the faint glow of distant lighthouses and the occasional flash of phosphorescence in the water, a reminder that beauty and danger often shared the same skin. Orhan stood at the prow, his cloak whipping in the wind, his mind turning over the faces of those he had left behind and those he would face ahead. He thought of Yakid's final sneer, of Daphne's venomous laughter, of the way betrayal always came wearing the mask of friendship or loyalty until the moment it struck. He thought of the emperor's distant hand moving pieces across a board where lives were pawns, of Andreas's ambition that had twisted a man into a tool, of Palladios's calm smile and the words he had spoken in the forest clearing about looms and threads and the killing power of choices. The crossing took the night and part of the following day, the galleys hugging the coastline to avoid the larger imperial patrols whose sails could be seen like white birds on the horizon. They slipped into a narrow inlet as the sun began to set on the second day, the water shallow and treacherous, the rocks rising sheer and dark. The men disembarked in silence, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, their weapons checked one final time under the cover of overhanging trees. Orhan led them upward along the cliff path, his hand on the stone for balance, the sea crashing far below like the breathing of a great beast that might wake at any moment and swallow them whole. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the faint metallic tang of fear that no man admitted but every man carried. They reached the drainage tunnels as full darkness fell, the openings hidden behind a screen of vines and loose stones that the scouts cleared with careful hands. The tunnels were narrow, slick with moss and the drip of seawater, the air thick and cold, forcing the men to move in single file with torches shielded to the faintest glow. Water echoed around them, the sound of the sea pushing through ancient cracks, and Orhan felt the weight of the fortress above like a living presence, stone and history pressing down with the memory of emperors who had built their power on the backs of those they conquered. The tunnel opened into a storage chamber filled with crates of supplies, and from there they moved into the service corridors, the stone floors worn smooth by centuries of servants carrying food and linens and secrets. The first guard fell without a sound, Shamel's blade sliding between ribs as the man turned a corner, his body lowered gently to the floor and dragged into shadow. Two more followed in quick succession, their throats cut in the dim light of wall sconces, their weapons taken and hidden. The group split as planned, Tarih vanishing down the western passage with his men, their footsteps fading into the labyrinth, Shamel moving toward the central hall where voices could already be heard murmuring behind heavy doors. Orhan led his own group deeper, toward the inner chambers where maps lay spread and ambitions festered, his sword drawn, his breath controlled, every sense sharpened to the point where the scrape of a boot on stone sounded like thunder. The corridor opened into a wider hall lined with tapestries depicting ancient victories, the faces of long-dead emperors staring down with painted eyes that seemed to follow the intruders. A door stood ajar at the far end, lamplight spilling through the gap, and Orhan signaled his men to wait while he approached alone, his footsteps silent on the woven rugs. He pushed the door wider and saw the room beyond, a chamber dominated by a large table covered in charts and letters, the walls lined with shelves of scrolls, the air heavy with the scent of ink and wax. Shahanshah stood at the table, his back to the door, his hands moving over a map as he spoke in low tones to a figure seated in shadow. Andreas's voice rose from the chair, sharp and impatient. The Sultan survived the road, he said. His agents failed, but Faladios has another plan, a choice that will break him without a single blade drawn. Shahanshah turned, his face drawn with the fatigue of a man caught between loyalty and ambition, and he replied that choices were dangerous things, that Orhan had already proven himself immune to simple traps. The two men argued softly, their words weaving a web of plots that involved poisoned letters sent to Bursa, false messengers carrying tales of Orhan's death, agents placed among the palace servants to turn Nilufer's ear against Asporcha and Asporcha's hand against the throne itself. Orhan stepped into the light, his sword raised, and the room froze. Shahanshah's eyes widened, his hand reaching for a bell that Orhan's blade struck aside with a single motion, the metal ringing against stone. Andreas rose from his chair, his face twisting with a mixture of fury and calculation, and he called for guards even as Orhan's men poured into the chamber from the corridor. Steel met steel in a clash that echoed through the stone halls, the fight contained at first to the room, bodies crashing against tables, scrolls scattering like fallen leaves. Orhan drove Andreas back against the wall, his blade at the man's throat, demanding the names, the roots, the full extent of the emperor's reach into Bursa's heart. Andreas laughed, a bitter sound, and told him that names were useless when the web was already woven, that even now Faladios was moving pieces that would force Orhan to choose between his realm and the women who held his soul. The door burst open again and imperial guards poured in, their numbers swelling the fight into chaos, and Orhan's men formed a defensive circle, their swords working in tight arcs as the room filled with smoke from an overturned lamp. Tarhin's group arrived from the western passage, their arrival turning the tide, and Shamel's force entered from the central hall, driving the remaining guards into retreat down the corridors. In the midst of the melee, Faladios appeared at the far doorway, his shoulder bandaged but his posture still elegant, his eyes meeting Orhan's across the chaos with a smile that held no warmth. He held a scroll in one hand and a small vial in the other, and he spoke over the din, his voice carrying like oil on water. "The choice is already made, Sultan," he called, The letter you will receive in Bursa will tell you that your palace burns, that your women are taken, that only surrender will save them. Or perhaps the letter will be a lie, and you will never know until you return to ashes." Orhan surged toward him, cutting down a guard in his path, but Faladios dropped the vial and it shattered, releasing a cloud of choking smoke that filled the chamber and turned the air into a burning haze. Men coughed and staggered, and in the confusion Faladios vanished once more, his laughter echoing from the corridor as the fight dissolved into a desperate scramble for breath and direction. Orhan's men dragged Andreas from the room, bound and gagged, while Shahansha was left behind, his eyes filled with the realization that his ambitions had led him to a cage of his own making. They retreated through the tunnels as the fortress awoke around them, horns sounding and boots pounding on stone above, the sea waiting below like a cold ally that could drown them or carry them to safety. The galleys pulled away under cover of darkness, the captured Andreas secured in the hold, the men nursing wounds and counting the cost in blood and breath. Orhan stood at the stern as Samandaria's lights faded behind them, the weight of Faladios's words settling over him like a shroud. The choice, whatever it was, waited in Bursa, and the sea seemed to stretch endlessly between him and the answer, each wave carrying the possibility that the web had already tightened around the ones he loved. The return voyage was a mirror of the outward journey but heavier with dread, the men silent, the oars dipping in a rhythm that matched the pounding of Orhan's thoughts. He replayed the chamber, the words, the vial shattering, and he saw in his mind the faces of Nilüfer and Asporça, the way their hands had clasped, the fragile strength they had built against the very forces that now sought to tear it apart. He thought of Malhatan's steady gaze, of the way she had prepared the palace for a war fought in whispers and shadows, and he prayed that her vigilance had been enough, that the letter Faladios spoke of was a lie meant to break his will rather than a truth already unfolding in the corridors of Bursa. They landed at the hidden cove under a sky turning from black to gray, the horses waiting where they had left them, and Orhan mounted without rest, spurring toward the palace with a speed that left the others behind. The fields and villages passed in a blur, the same shepherds watching with the same wary eyes, the same smoke rising from the same chimneys, but now every detail carried the edge of impending loss. As the walls of Bursa rose before him, he saw the gates open and the guards step aside, their faces pale, and he knew before he entered that the web had reached inside. The courtyard was quiet, too quiet, the fountain still running but the air thick with the aftermath of something broken. Malhatan met him at the steps, her face composed but her eyes carrying the shadow of hours spent in fear, and she told him that a messenger had arrived at dawn with a sealed letter bearing the imperial mark, that the letter had been intercepted and burned before it could reach Nilüfer or Asporça, that the palace still stood, but that the attempt had come too close. Orhan dismounted and entered the inner chambers, where Nilüfer and Asporça waited, their hands once more clasped, their faces showing the strain of a night spent listening for footsteps that might bring betrayal or rescue. He told them of the capture of Andreas, of Faladios's escape, of the choice that had been offered and refused, and as he spoke the three women listened without interruption, their resolve hardening with each word. The realm had survived another blade, another whisper, another attempt to turn love into a weapon, but the war was far from over. The emperor would send more, Faladios would return with new threads, Shahansha's fate would become another piece on the board, and Orhan knew that the next strike would not come from the forest or the sea but from the places where trust lived, where hearts beat closest to one another. The night deepened over Bursa, the palace settling into a watchful quiet, the captured Andreas held in a chamber beneath the ground where no light reached, his secrets waiting to be drawn out by the slow work of interrogation and time. Orhan walked the corridors alone for a time, his sword sheathed but his mind still moving through the tunnels of Samandaria, the smoke of the shattered vial, the smile on Faladios's face. He stopped at the window where Nilüfer had stood so often, and he looked out over the city, the lights of homes and the distant fires of camps, the realm that demanded everything and gave back only the chance to fight another day. In the distance, beyond the hills and the sea, the emperor's court stirred with news of the raid, Andreas's absence a wound that would fester into new plans, new agents, new poisons. Faladios moved through those halls like a shadow given form, already weaving the next trap, already preparing the choice that would test whether Orhan's will was iron or merely steel that could be bent. The women of the palace slept fitfully, their alliance a small flame against the gathering dark, and the soldiers kept watch on walls and gates, their eyes scanning the horizon for the next shadow that might carry a blade. Orhan returned to his chamber as the first light of dawn touched the sky, and he sat for a moment with the map of the realm spread before him, the lines and names and routes that represented lives and loyalties and the endless dance of power. He traced the path from Bursa to Samandaria and back, and he knew that the wheel had turned again, that the story was not ending but deepening, that the battles ahead would be fought not only with steel but with the choices that defined what a man would sacrifice and what he would protect. The fire in the hearth burned low, the smoke rising in thin spirals, and outside the wind moved through the olive groves like a whisper of things yet to come, carrying the scent of salt and earth and the faint promise of storms that had not yet broken. And so the night gave way to day, the palace breathed, the realm endured, and Orhan Sahib prepared for the next turn of the wheel, his heart heavy with the knowledge that every victory carried the seed of the next challenge, every bond forged in fire tested by the shadows that never truly slept. The story moved forward, slow and inexorable, like the tide that had carried him to Samandaria and back, and somewhere in the distance the drums of the greater war beat on, waiting for the moment when the choice Faladios had promised would finally arrive, sharp and inevitable, demanding an answer that would shape not only the fate of Bursa, but the destiny of every soul caught in its web.
Orhan walked into the front line, and the world narrowed to mud, steel, and breath. He did not shout, he did not raise his sword above his head. He simply stepped between two shieldmen, took his place in the line, and raised his shield. That was enough. A murmur moved through the ranks, not a cheer, not a roar, but a deep, animal sound of recognition and resolve. The men who had begun to bend, who had begun to feel the weight of the imperial spears pressing them backward, straightened. The shield wall locked, the line hardened. When the next wave of imperial infantry struck, it hit not flesh and fear, but stone. For 3 hours they stood there, 3 hours of grinding, unglamorous death. There were no great duels, no heroic charges, no moments that would be sung around campfires. There was only endurance. A spear thrust into a gap between shields, an axe chopping through wood, a man falling, another stepping into his place before his body hit the ground, boots slipping on mud thick with blood, men grunting, men choking, men dying without a sound. Orhan fought like any other man there. He took a spear graze across his upper arm. He blocked a blow that would have split the skull of the boy beside him. He drove his sword through the throat of an imperial soldier, then pulled it free and was already moving to parry the next strike before the man had fallen. His burned hand screamed with every movement, his shoulder ached, his lungs burned, but he did not step back, not even an inch. Mavrikios watched from his command position on the southern rise, and for the first time that day his face changed. He had planned for every possible response except this. He had planned for cavalry charges, for feigned retreats, for ambushes, for anger, for pride, for greed. He had not planned for a sultan who would choose to stand in the mud with the lowest soldier. He had not planned for will. He sent messengers to urge the center forward. He sent orders to the western wing to renew their attack. He sent reserves to try and stabilize the crumbling eastern flank where Tarih was still cutting through his men like a scythe through dry grass, but nothing moved fast enough now. The battle had stopped being a contest of plans and had become a contest of soul. By mid-afternoon, the rain stopped. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time all day, and it fell across the field like cold silver, and then the imperial line bent. It was not a break, it was not a rout, it was a small, almost invisible thing. One man stepped back, then another, then 10, then 100. The grinding pressure of the shield wall had not broken them, but it had worn them. They had marched for 3 days, they had fought for 6 hours, they had seen their reserves torn apart by cavalry, they had seen their commanders fall, and they had seen the man they had come to kill standing in the front line, still fighting, still breathing, still unbroken. Tarih saw the bend first. He roared a command, and his cavalry shifted from cutting up stragglers to driving inward toward the center of the imperial line. Shammel saw it next, and he ordered the archers to stop firing at long range and move forward to pour arrows into the gaps opening in the enemy formation. Orhan saw it last because he was too close to the line to see the shape of it, but he felt it. The pressure on his shield lessened. The spears stopped coming quite so fast. The grunts of the men opposite him became tired, became afraid. He raised his sword. "Forward," he said, and his voice carried all the way down the line. The Ottoman shield wall moved. It did not charge, it advanced, step by step, shield to shield, boot on boot, every man moving as one. The imperial line fell back before it, men threw down their spears, men turned and ran, men knelt and surrendered. Mavrikios saw it and did not rage, he did not curse, he simply nodded as if accepting a verdict. He gave one final order, an orderly retreat. It was the mark of a great commander. Even in defeat, he did not allow his army to dissolve into a rout. He sent his best remaining men to form a rearguard. He ordered the wounded who could walk to be brought back. He abandoned the baggage and the tents and the field equipment, but he saved the core of his army. He withdrew across the southern stream, formed a new line on the opposite bank, and waited. He did not run, he simply stopped fighting. Orhan halted the advance at the stream. He did not order a pursuit. He knew that Mavrikios would turn and tear apart any force foolish enough to follow him across that water. The battle was over. Iron dawn had been broken on the plain of Damascus. Silence fell over the field. It was the worst silence of all, the silence after the drums stop, the silence when the screaming ends, the silence when you look around and see what it cost. Men lowered their shields, men leaned on their swords, men sat down in the mud and began to cry, not from pain but from the sudden release of tension that had held them upright for 6 hours. Wounded men began to call out, healers moved among the bodies, burial parties began the terrible work of separating friend from foe, smoke rose from small fires lit to warm the cold and the dying, crows began to circle above the field. Orhan stood in the middle of that silence, his sword still in his hand, his armor dented, his face streaked with mud and blood that was not his own. He did not celebrate, he did not give a victory speech. He simply stood there and looked out across the thousands of bodies scattered across the plain, and he felt the terrible, hollow weight of victory. He had won. He had broken the greatest imperial army sent against the Ottomans in a generation. He had turned back Iron Dawn. And it tasted like ash in his mouth. Tarih found him there an hour later, his arm bandaged crudely, his ribs bruised, his face still bright with the fire of battle. He said that the rearguard had withdrawn at dusk. Mavrikios was marching back toward the coast. They had captured nearly 500 prisoners. They had recovered all the imperial baggage. They had won. It was the greatest victory in a generation. Orhan nodded, but he did not smile. He said that Mavrikios had withdrawn too well. That he had lost the battle but saved his army. That this was not the end. Shamil arrived next, carrying Mavrikios' standard, captured by one of his scouts. He laid it on the ground at Orhan's feet. He said that messengers were already being prepared to carry the news to Bursa, to the tribes, to every village on the frontier, that the name of Damascus would be remembered for 1,000 years. Orhan looked at the standard and he said nothing. There was a cold feeling in his bones, a sense that something was very wrong, that they had missed something. That the victory had come too easily at the end. Then the rider came. He arrived out of the darkness, galloping hard from the east, his horse foaming, his cloak torn, his face white with terror. He did not stop at the sentry line. He rode straight into the camp, straight up to where the 3 men stood, and he fell from his horse before he could even speak. Tarih caught him. The man gasped for air, and the first words out of his mouth turned the victory to dust. Faladios is gone. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Orhan said very quietly, "What?" The rider gasped out the story. 3 nights earlier, on the second day of the battle, Faladios had escaped. He had killed 3 guards, he had stolen clothes, he had slipped out of the palace through an old drainage tunnel that no one had remembered existed, he had taken a horse from the outer stables, he had vanished. Mal Hatun had sealed the city. She had sent riders in every direction, but he was gone, and before he left he had left a note, taped to the inside of the door of his cell. The rider pulled a crumpled piece of parchment from inside his tunic and handed it to Orhan. Orhan unfolded it. There were only 3 lines, written in Faladios' elegant hand. "Thank you for the battle. It was a very convincing distraction. I will see you in Bursa." The world tilted. Orhan looked at the note, he looked at the field of dead men, he looked at Mavrikios' standard lying in the mud, and he understood all of it, every single part of it. Calavrai, St. Michael, the aqueduct, the marsh, the bridge, Damascus, all of it, every battle, every trap, every victory, every defeat, it had all been bait. Faladios had never intended to win any of them. He had intended to lose them. He had let himself be captured, he had let Orhan win at Calavrai, he had fed him information, he had guided him from one battle to the next, he had pulled every commander, every loyal man, every soldier, every eye, every thought away from Bursa. He had built Iron Dawn not as an invasion but as the greatest distraction in the history of the frontier. He had known that Orhan would come to Damascus. He had known that Tarih would come. He had known that Shamil would come. He had known that every man who could be trusted to defend Bursa would ride away to fight a battle that was never intended to be won. And while they were all here, standing on a field of victory, Faladios was already moving on Bursa. Mavrikios had not lost the battle. He had fulfilled his part of the bargain. He had kept them occupied for exactly long enough. Tarih was the first to speak. His voice was raw with rage and disbelief. He He said that Faladios could not take Bursa. There were still guards, there was Malhattan, there was Nilüfer, there was a Sporcha. Orhan shook his head slowly. He said that Faladios did not need an army to take Bursa. He only needed 3 days while no one was watching. He only needed traitors inside the walls who had been waiting for this exact moment. He only needed doubt. He only needed chaos. He only needed the Sultan to be 3 days' ride away. Shamal said that the city was sealed, that the gates were locked, that Malhattan would hold. Orhan looked at him and said that Malhattan was the best of them, but even Malhattan could not be everywhere, and Faladios knew every crack in those walls, he knew every servant, he knew every guard, he knew every weakness. He had drawn the map of Bursa from memory while he sat in chains, and he had 3 days' head start. Orhan turned and walked toward his horse. He did not give any grand order, he said only one thing: we ride now. They left the battlefield before dawn, they left the dead unburied, they left the wounded under a small guard, they left the prisoners, they left the victory. They took only the fastest horses and the hardest men, 200 riders, no baggage, no drums, no banners. They rode through the night and through the next day and through the next night. They changed horses at every outpost. They did not stop to eat. They did not stop to sleep. They rode until horses collapsed beneath them. They rode until men began to sway in their saddles from exhaustion. They rode because every minute was a minute Faladios had inside Bursa. Tarih rode beside Orhan, silent now, his rage turned cold and hard. Shamal rode ahead, clearing the road, sending scouts forward to ride ahead and bring back news. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The greatest victory of their lives had turned out to be the greatest trap, and now they were racing home, not knowing what they would find when they arrived. On the 3rd dawn, they crested the final ridge above Bursa. They reined in their horses. Below them, the city lay quiet in the first light. The gates were closed, no smoke rose from burning buildings, no fighting could be seen, no banners had been changed, it looked exactly as they had left it. But something was wrong. There were no guards on the outer watchtowers. No movement on the walls. No sound. The city was silent. Too silent. Orhan sat on Karanlik and he looked down at the city he had built, the city he had fought for, the city he had left in the hands of the women he loved. And he did not know if they were still alive. He did not know if the palace still stood. He did not know if he had ridden all this way only to find ash. A scout returned from ahead, his face pale. He said that there was no one at the outer gate, no sentry, no answer to calls, the road was empty, the villages outside were empty. Tarih drew his sword, he said that they would ride down and break the gate. Orhan held up his hand, he did not move, he kept staring at the silent city. And then from the highest tower of the palace, a single lantern flashed. 3 times. Slow. Even. The prearranged signal for all is well. Orhan breathed out a breath he did not know he had been holding for 3 days. But before he could speak, another lantern flashed from a lower tower. 1 long flash. Too short. He is still inside. Faladios. He had not taken the city. He had not run. He was still there. Waiting. Orhan looked down at the silent gates of Bursa and he understood that the Battle of Damanus was over. Iron Dawn was broken, Mavrikios had returned to the sea, but the real war had only just begun, and this time it would not be fought on open plains, it would be fought in corridors, in bedchambers, in kitchens, in the dark places between trust and betrayal. This time it would be fought inside his own home. He kicked Karanlik forward. Come, he said, let us go home. And the 200 riders descended the ridge toward the silent gates, and the final act began. The month that followed the burning of Karasi unfolded like the slow tightening of a bowstring, each day adding tension to the air, until the realm itself seemed to vibrate with the knowledge that the emperor's response would not merely be another raid or another poison letter, but something that would test the very foundations of what Orhan Sahib had built. The galleys that had carried the raiding force back to Bursa were repaired in the hidden cove and hidden beneath nets of brush and earth, their crews resting but their blades kept sharp, while the captured documents from the harbor were studied until every name and route had been burned into the memories of the commanders who gathered in the strategy chamber each night under the flickering lamplight. The emperor's rage, as reported by the coastal messengers who arrived weekly with news that grew darker with each telling, had not cooled but instead burned brighter, his court in Constantinople alive with the furious energy of a man who had been humiliated and sought to answer that humiliation with overwhelming force. Orhan felt the coming of it like a rider feels the shift in wind before a storm, a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest. the instinct that had guided him through ambushes and raids now warning that the next blow would not come from shadows and whispers, but from the full might of an empire that had underestimated him once and would not do so again. He walked the walls of Bursa each evening as the sun dipped below the western hills, the light catching the distant sea where the emperor's fleet was said to be gathering, and he spoke quietly with Shammel about the fortifications that would need strengthening, the supply lines that would need protection, and the alliances with the highland tribes that would need to be renewed before the first ships appeared on the horizon. The captured men in the underground chamber yielded their final secrets in the weeks that followed, each name a thread pulled from the tapestry, each route a line drawn on the map that revealed the full extent of the emperor's ambition. And as the web was dismantled thread by thread, Orhan felt not the satisfaction of victory, but the deepening understanding that the emperor would simply weave another, larger and more dangerous than the first. It was during one of these quiet evenings, the sky turning from gold to violet as the watchfires were lit along the walls, that a rider appeared on the southern road, his horse lathered, his cloak torn, his face twisted with the effort of a man who had pushed himself and his mount beyond the limits of endurance. The guards at the gate challenged him, but he thrust a sealed letter forward, the wax bearing the mark of an allied tribe that had sworn loyalty to the Ottoman cause years before, and within minutes the letter was in Orhan's hands, its contents turning the evening air to ice. The highland tribes of the eastern passes, the very alliances that secured the mountain routes and provided the cavalry that would be essential in any defense against the emperor's land forces, were being offered a choice by a new envoy of the imperial court: swear fealty to Constantinople and receive the protection of the emperor's armies, or remain loyal to Orhan and face annihilation when the fleet arrived. The letter was written by a man named Dragan, a commander of the Serbian auxiliary forces who had served the emperor for decades and who now carried the authority of the imperial court to the remote settlements where the tribes gathered in their summer camps. He had arrived 3 days earlier with a small escort of heavy cavalry and crates of gold coins and fine weapons meant to sway the undecided, and he had begun his work in the villages and grazing lands with the smooth persuasion of a man who understood that loyalty was a commodity bought with the promise of survival rather than the abstract notion of honor. The tribal elders, caught between the fear of Ottoman defeat and the memory of bonds forged in shared battles, had hesitated, and that hesitation was itself a danger, for in war the undecided were as dangerous as the enemy, their indecision a crack that could spread and bring the entire wall down. Orhan read the letter twice, his face betraying nothing, and then he summoned Tarih and Ebrenos to the map room where the evening shadows grew long across the parchment. The problem was clear. If the tribes defected, the eastern passes would be open, and the emperor's land forces could pour through the mountains without opposition, outflanking Bursa and cutting off the supply lines that sustained the realm. But riding to the tribes with force would be counterproductive, turning the persuasion into coercion and driving them toward the emperor's offer rather than away from it. What was needed was not a sword but a voice that carried the weight of the Sultan's word and the personal bond that bound him to the men who had fought beside him in the battles of years past. Orhan would ride to the eastern passes himself with a small escort, arriving at the summer gathering before Dragan could complete his work, and he would speak to the elders face to face, the way his father had spoken to them, the way the bond between the Ottoman house and the highland tribes had always been sealed not with gold but with the promise of shared sacrifice. The decision was made with the swiftness that marked Orhan's counsels, and as the night deepened he prepared to ride before dawn, choosing 20 of his finest men, warriors whose names were known and trusted among the tribes, their faces carrying the marks of 100 battles. Isporcha, who had returned from the coastal raids with a new edge to her presence, a quiet confidence born of having proven herself in combat, insisted on riding with him, and this time Orhan did not refuse, understanding that her presence would speak to the tribes in ways that his alone could not, that the sight of a woman warrior standing beside the Sultan would carry a message about the depth of the Ottoman commitment that no amount of speeches could match. Nilüfer, who had grown stronger with each passing threat, her hands no longer trembling when the talk turned to war, embraced Orhan at the palace gate and told him that the realm would hold while he was gone, that she and Malhattan would keep the city as he had taught them, and Isporcha embraced her in turn, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year before but was now as natural as the bond that had been forged in fire and tested by poison and lies. They rode out as the first light of dawn touched the eastern hills, Orhan and Isporcha and the 20 riders, their horses moving swift and sure across the inland trails that wound through the mountains toward the highland pastures where the tribes gathered each summer. The journey took them through terrain that changed with each passing mile, from the rolling hills near Bursa to the steeper slopes where pine forests thickened and the air grew thin and cold, the distant peaks rising like the teeth of a great beast that guarded the passes between the lowlands and the eastern territories. They rode hard through the day and into the night, stopping only to water the horses and eat the dried meat and bread that they carried in their saddlebags, and by the second morning they had reached the high ground where the summer camps began to appear, clusters of felt tents and stone shelters scattered across the plateaus, the smoke of cook fires rising thin against the mountain sky. The tribes had already begun to gather, their flocks spread across the higher pastures, their children running between the tents while the men sat in councils that stretched from dawn to dusk, arguing about the choice that Dragon had placed before them. The arrival of Orhan's small force caused a stir that rippled through the camps like wind through a field of grass, riders coming to the edge of the plateau to watch the Ottoman banners approach, their faces unreadable as they weighed the implications of the Sultan's presence. Orhan dismounted at the edge of the largest camp where the elder council had convened under a great canopy of woven wool, and he walked forward without escort, a sportia beside him, their swords visible but sheathed, their posture open, their message clear. They came not as conquerors but as brothers seeking counsel. The elder council was a circle of men whose faces bore the marks of decades spent in the mountains, their skin weathered by wind and sun, their eyes sharp with the particular kind of intelligence that came from a life lived close to the earth, where a wrong decision could mean the death of an entire clan. They had been debating Dragon's offer when Orhan arrived, and the Serbian envoy himself was present, seated on a stone with his heavy cavalry waiting at the edge of the camp, his face showing a flicker of surprise when the Sultan appeared. Dragon was a broad-shouldered man with a scarred face and the bearing of a professional soldier who had served many masters without ever truly belonging to any, and he rose to his feet with a nod of recognition, his eyes measuring Orhan with the cool assessment of one predator acknowledging another. "The Sultan has come far," Dragon said, his voice carrying the accent of the northern provinces, "and he has come fast. I had heard that Bursa was under siege from whispers and knives. I did not expect the Sultan to leave his palace at such a time." Orhan looked at him and replied that a man did not send messengers to speak for him when the bond in question was one of blood and shared sacrifice, that the matters between the Ottoman house and the Highland tribes were not transactions to be negotiated by envoys carrying gold, but sacred oaths sealed in the fire of battles fought side by side. He turned to the elder council, his voice shifting from the controlled edge he had used with Dragon to a tone that carried the weight of history, and he spoke of the first time his father had ridden to these same camps, of the oath that had been sworn under this same sky, of the battles that had been fought in the passes where the tribes and the Ottomans had stood together against enemies who sought to divide and conquer through the very Chinese letter that Dragon now employed. He spoke for a long time, his words weaving through the memories of the elders like thread through cloth, recalling specific battles, specific names, specific moments when the bond between them had been tested and had held. He told them of Juljaha, of the supply train burning in the night, of the tunnels of Samandaria, of the raids on the coast, and he told them that the emperor's offer of gold and protection was the same offer that had been made to every tribe and every kingdom that Constantinople sought to absorb, the promise of safety that ended in the chains of servitude. He spoke of what it meant to be free, to govern themselves, to stand as partners rather than subjects, and he told them that the choice before them was not between the emperor and Orhan, but between freedom and slavery, between the mountain air they breathed and the stench of imperial incense in a foreign court. Dragon listened without interruption, his face a mask of polite interest, and when Orhan had finished he stepped forward and delivered his own counter, his voice smooth and persuasive, speaking of the overwhelming force that the emperor was assembling, of the fleet that would blot out the horizon, of the land armies that would pour through the passes like a flood. And he asked the elders whether the wisest course was not to accept the emperor's protection and preserve their people for the future rather than follow Orhan to what might well be a glorious but fatal last stand. The words were carefully chosen, each one a thread designed to pull at the fear that lived in every father's heart, the fear that his children would not see another summer, and Orhan saw the effect on the elders' faces, the flicker of doubt, the way their eyes shifted between the two men as if weighing the promises of the living against the certainties of the dead. Esportia stepped forward then, her presence commanding attention in the way that only those who had walked through fire could manage, and she spoke not of strategy or bonds but of what she had seen with her own eyes, the way the men of the tribes had fought alongside the Ottomans at Juljaha, the way they had stood shoulder to shoulder in the burning supply train, the way they had given their blood without hesitation when the enemy closed in from all sides. She spoke of the women and children who waited in these camps for their men to return, and she asked the elders whether the emperor's protection would extend to those families when the wars were done, or whether they would be scattered across the empire as laborers and servants, their mountain homes taken by imperial garrisons. The question struck the heart of the matter, and the silence that followed was long and heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a decision. The eldest of the council, a man named Korkut whose white beard reached his chest and whose eyes held the wisdom of a man who had survived 7 sultans and 3 major wars, rose slowly to his feet, his staff planted firmly in the earth, and he spoke with the gravity of one who understood that his words would echo through generations. He told the council that the emperor's gold would rust and the emperor's promises would turn to ash, as all imperial promises did, but that the blood oath sworn between the tribes and the Ottoman house was written in the hearts of men who had died together, and who would judge the living if that oath was broken for the sake of temporary safety. He looked at Dragon with eyes that held no malice but only the clear recognition of a threat dressed in silk, and he told the Serbian envoy that the mountains did not belong to emperors, that they belonged to those who lived upon them and who would defend them with the last breath in their lungs. Korkut turned to Orhan and spoke the words that sealed the council's decision, telling him that the tribes would stand with the Ottomans as they always had, that the passes would be defended, that the emperor's land forces would find not the open road they expected but a wall of stone and steel, and the fury of men defending their homes. The other elders nodded, their faces hardening with the resolve that came from a decision made not from fear, but from the deep understanding that some things could not be bought or negotiated, but only defended with the blood of those who held them sacred. Dragon's expression shifted, the smooth mask cracking slightly to reveal the frustration beneath, but he was a professional, and he nodded in acceptance, mounting his horse with the controlled movements of a man who would carry the failure back to his master and begin planning the next attempt. Orhan clasped Korkut's hand and embraced him, the gesture speaking louder than any words, and Esportia did the same with the women of the camp, her presence among them a bridge that strengthened the bond between the Highland tribes and the Ottoman house in a way that no letter or envoy could replicate. They stayed for 3 days, sharing meals and discussing the defense of the passes, the placement of watchtowers along the approaches, the routes that the tribe's horsemen would use to harry the enemy's supply lines while the main Ottoman force held the strong points. Dragon departed on the 2nd day with his heavy cavalry, their gold-laden wagons turning south toward the coast, and as they disappeared over the ridge, Orhan felt the tension in the camp ease, the doubt dissipated, the alliance renewed with a strength that would be tested in the months to come. The ride back to Bursa was faster than the ride out, the urgency of the fleet's approach driving them forward, and they reached the palace as the sun was setting on the 3rd day, the city bathed in the amber light that turned the walls to gold and the streets to rivers of shadow. Nilüfer met them at the gate with news that the first ships of the emperor's fleet had been spotted on the horizon, their sails visible at dawn like white teeth against the gray sea, and the gathering had begun in earnest. The council convened within the hour, the map room filling with commanders whose faces showed the strain of preparations that had consumed them for weeks, and Orhan laid out the combined strategy that the alliance with the Highland tribes had made possible. The defense would be layered, he explained, his finger tracing the routes on the map that showed the approaches from the sea and through the mountains. Shamal would command the coastal defenses, fortifying the cliffs and the hidden coves where the imperial galleys would attempt their landings, while Tarhin would lead the mobile force that would strike at the flanks of any army that made it ashore. The tribes, now bound by the renewed oath, would defend the eastern passes, their knowledge of the terrain turning the mountains into a killing ground where the emperor's land forces would be bled white before they ever reached the lowlands. Ebrenos would coordinate the intelligence network, watching for the spies and agents who would undoubtedly accompany the fleet, while Malhattan and Nilüfer would hold the city itself, maintaining order among the populace and ensuring that the heart of the realm did not falter even as the edges were tested by fire. Esportia spoke then, her voice carrying the quiet authority she had earned in the raids and the Highland visit, and she told the council that she would ride with the coastal force, not as a symbol but as a commander, her experience in the harbor raid having proven her ability to lead men in close combat where the difference between survival and death lay in the split-second decisions that only those who had faced the blade could make. Orhan looked at her and saw not the woman who had stood beside him in the moonlight but the warrior who had fought through smoke and fire, and he nodded once, the gesture carrying the full weight of his trust. Nilüfer placed her hand on Esportia's arm, a brief touch that spoke volumes, and the two women exchanged a look that would have been impossible to interpret for anyone who had not witnessed the journey that had brought them to this point, the journey from rivals to allies, from shadows to pillars of the realm. The preparations accelerated as the fleet grew on the horizon, the ships appearing each day in greater numbers until the white sails covered the sea like a blanket of imperial ambition. The people of Bursa went about their lives with the grim determination of those who had learned to live under the shadow of war, their prayers more fervent, their acts of kindness more frequent, their understanding that the world they knew hung in the balance and that their sultan stood between them and the abyss. The soldiers moved through the streets with purpose, carrying supplies to the walls, reinforcing gates, sharpening weapons that had been sharpened 100 times before, their eyes meeting those of the civilians with the shared knowledge that what was coming would test them all. On the night before the fleet was expected to make its first landing attempt, Orhan walked the walls alone, the wind carrying the scent of salt and the faintest trace of smoke from the watchfires that lined the coast. He stopped at the highest point of the battlements and looked out across the dark water, and he saw the fires of the imperial ships dotting the horizon like a field of stars that had fallen from the sky to wage war upon the earth. The sight was both terrifying and beautiful, a reminder of the vastness of the force arrayed against them and the smallness of the realm they defended, and yet Orhan felt not fear but a strange and terrible calm, the kind that comes when a man has accepted the full weight of what lies before him and has chosen to carry it rather than be crushed. He thought of the faces that had brought him to this moment, of his father who had forged the first alliance with the tribes, of Korkut's white beard and steady eyes, of Tarhin's fierce loyalty, of Shamel's cold precision, of Ebrenos's quiet intelligence, of Malhatan's unbreakable resolve, of Nilufer's fierce grace, of Esporcha's warrior's heart. He thought of the men who had fallen along the way, their names carved into his memory like inscriptions on stone, and he spoke their names into the wind, a prayer and a promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. He thought of Darsan, still recovering from his wounds in the southern village, of Mustafa who had saved his life with torn cloth and desperate hands, of the countless unnamed soldiers who had bled on the roads and in the forests and in the tunnels beneath foreign fortresses. And then he thought of what lay ahead, the battle that would define not just his reign but the fate of the realm for generations to come, and he made the quiet vow that had lived in his heart since the day he first drew a sword: he would stand, not for glory, not for a throne, not for the songs of poets. He would stand for the right of his people to live in peace, for the right of the women he loved to walk in safety, for the right of the children who played in the streets below to grow old without knowing the yoke of empire. He would stand until his last breath left his body and his blood joined the earth that had given him everything. The morning came with the sound of horns, not from the palace walls but from the distant shore where the first imperial boats had been spotted cutting through the dawn mist, their oars moving in the relentless rhythm of an army that had traveled across the sea to make war upon a realm they believed would crumble at the first blow. The fleet had split, some ships moving toward the coastal cliffs where Shamel's archers waited in their hidden positions, others heading for the shallower waters near the harbor where the landing craft could beach themselves and disgorge the infantry that would form the vanguard. The sky filled with the sound of wind in sails and the distant crash of waves against rock, and the morning light caught the imperial banners as they unfurled, their colors bright against the gray of the sea. Shamel gave the order, and the archers rose from their hiding places along the cliff tops, their bows drawn, their arrows tipped with the oil that would ignite when they struck the canvas of the landing boats. The first volley flew in a dark arc across the sky, falling like a rain of fire upon the nearest boats, the flames catching quickly on the old cloth, turning the water into a mirror of destruction as men jumped from the burning hulls into the cold sea. The imperial commanders adjusted, sending the boats in wider formations, and the landing became a chaotic struggle against both the defenders on the cliffs and the natural obstacles of the rocky shore, the water churning with the effort of thousands of men trying to reach land while arrows fell and the screams of the wounded mixed with the roar of the surf. On the inland side of the coast, Tarhin's mobile force waited in the cover of the olive groves, their horses held by the reins, their riders watching the shore through the gaps in the trees. When the first Imperial infantry managed to reach the beach and form a defensive line, Tarhin gave the signal and the Ottoman cavalry surged forward in a thundering wave, their blades drawn, their voices rising in the war cry that had become the signature of the realm's defenders. The impact was devastating, the Imperial infantry caught between the sea and the cavalry, their shields forming a fragile wall that buckled under the weight of the charge. The fight that followed was brutal and intimate, the kind of close combat where the noise was deafening and the world shrank to the space between two blades, and the beach became a mosaic of bodies and steel, and the deep red of blood mixing with the foam of the waves. Esporcha led a flanking maneuver along the cliff base, her small unit of hand-picked warriors moving through the narrow paths that the Imperial scouts had failed to map, their arrival behind the enemy's second wave turning the landing into a trap rather than a foothold. She fought with the precision and fury that had marked her duels in the palace and the raids on the coast, her blade cutting through the Imperial infantry's flank like a scythe through wheat, and the men who followed her fought with the kind of desperate courage that comes from knowing that failure meant the destruction of everything they loved. The battle raged through the morning and into the afternoon, the tides shifting with each hour as reinforcements arrived from both sides, the imperial fleet sending wave after wave of landing boats while Orhan's forces responded with archers, cavalry, and the fierce determination of men who fought on their own ground. The noise was tremendous, a wall of sound that could be heard miles inland, and in the villages and towns beyond the coast the people listened with prayers on their lips and their hands clasped around whatever they held dear, trusting that their sultan would hold the line. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the imperial forces on the beach had been reduced to a narrow foothold, their attempts to push inland blocked by Tarhin's cavalry, their retreat to the sea cut off by Esporcha's flanking force. The commander of the imperial landing, a man whose name had been spoken in the underground chamber during the interrogations of Andreas and Palladios, sent a messenger to the fleet requesting reinforcement, but the fires that Shammel's archers had set among the remaining boats had spread to the supply ships, and the smoke that rose from the burning fleet was visible for miles along the coast, a signal of the first great defeat that the Emperor's forces had suffered since the campaign began. Orhan arrived on the battlefield as the last light faded, riding Karenlik along the cliff path with a reserve force that had been held back precisely for this moment, the moment when the enemy was broken but not yet destroyed, when the final blow could turn retreat into rout and victory into legend. He rode down to the beach with his sword drawn, and the sight of the Ottoman banner appearing at the edge of the battle was enough to break the last of the imperial resistance, the surviving soldiers throwing down their weapons or plunging into the sea in desperate attempts to reach the surviving ships. The night fell on a battlefield strewn with the debris of war, the sand stained dark, the water lapping at the hulls of burning boats, and Orhan stood at the water's edge with Tarhin and Shammel and Esporcha, their faces marked with the grime and blood of the day's fighting, and they looked out across the sea where the imperial fleet was retreating toward the horizon, its numbers diminished, its ambition wounded. It was not the final victory, they all knew, for the fleet would return and the emperor would send more armies, but it was the first great blow, the proof that the realm could not be taken by force, that the alliances forged in fire and loyalty would hold against the might of empire. Tarhin clapped Orhan on the shoulder and told him that the beach would be remembered for generations, and Shammel added that the losses among the imperial fleet were severe enough to buy them time, perhaps months, perhaps longer if the emperor's attention turned to other fronts. Esporcha stood quietly, her blade still dripping with the sea spray that had mixed with blood during the fight, and she told Orhan that the women of the coastal villages had come out with water and cloth to tend the wounded, their courage as fierce as any warriors, and that the realm was stronger than any wall or fleet because its strength lived in the hearts of those who chose to stand. They returned to Bursa as a triumph, the news spreading ahead of them through the villages and towns, the people pouring into the streets to cheer the Sultan and his warriors, their faces alight with the joy of survival and the fierce pride of a realm that had faced the storm and not broken. The palace received them with Mal Hatun standing at the steps, her eyes bright with tears that she did not try to hide, and Nilüfer waiting inside with her arms open and her heart on her face. The quiet strength that had held the city together now released in a moment of embrace that spoke of love forged not in comfort but in the crucible of repeated danger. That night, as the celebrations quieted and the fires burned low, Orhan stood once more at the window of his chamber, the same window that had framed so many moments of reflection, and he looked out over the city that had held, the walls that had not fallen, the people who had not broken. The sea was calm now, the last traces of smoke fading from the horizon, and the stars burned bright above the hills like the eyes of all who had fought and fallen watching over the realm they had given everything to protect. Orhan placed his hand on the stone and closed his eyes, and in the silence of the night he felt the wheel turn once more, slow and inexorable, carrying them toward the next chapter, the next challenge, the next moment when the choices made by a sultan and the people who loved him would shape the destiny of nations. And somewhere beyond the sea, in the cold halls of Constantinople, the emperor sat in silence as his commanders delivered the news of the defeat, their voices low, their eyes averted, and the rage that burned in his chest was the rage of a man who had believed himself invincible and had been proven otherwise by a realm he had dismissed as a collection of tribal villages. He would send more ships, more armies, more agents with their vials and their letters, because the pride of empire could not tolerate the existence of a power that had defied it and survived. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, in his court and in his commanders' minds, and the knowledge that Orhan Saheb was not merely a tribal chieftain, but a strategist and a warrior of rare ability would haunt the emperor's calculations for years to come, turning every future decision into a reflection of the battles already lost. The story continued, as stories always did, not with the clean resolution of a tale told to children, but with the messy, complicated, deeply human reality of a world where victory was never final and defeat was never the end, where the bonds between people were tested by every passing storm and strengthened or broken by the choices made in the quiet moments between battles. Orhan Sahib stood at his window and breathed, and the night embraced him, and the wheel turned, and the realm endured, waiting for the dawn that would bring new challenges and new chances to prove that the light of loyalty and courage could not be extinguished by the shadows of empire. The snow began to fall on the morning after the depot burned, soft and relentless, blanketing the hills in a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very memory of fire. And Orhan Sahib stood at the edge of the courtyard watching the flakes settle on the stone, on the cloaks of the returning riders, on the wooden wheels of the grain wagons that had been hauled through frost and shadow to keep the city from starving, and he felt the weight of the season settle over him like a second mantle, heavier than steel. More binding than any oath, because winter did not care for victories or defeats, it only demanded endurance, and endurance was the one thing empires could not buy with gold or force with fleets. The city breathed around him, the streets quiet but alive with the steady rhythm of survival, women carrying sacks of salt and barley to the communal stores, men repairing harnesses and sharpening blades that had been dulled by ash and ice, children pressing their faces to frosted windows to watch the Sultan's riders dismount, their eyes wide with the quiet awe of those who had learned early that peace was not the absence of war, but the presence of those who stood between them and the dark. Tarih approached through the falling snow, his cloak heavy with frost, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who had ridden hard and fought harder, and he reported that the southern route was secure, that the imperial scouts had been driven back to the coast, that the captured grain would stretch the granaries through the worst of the season if rationed wisely, but his voice carried no triumph, only the weary acknowledgement that the sea would not forget its master's pride. That the emperor's patience was measured in seasons rather than days, and that the blockade would tighten as the passes closed and the waters froze. Shamil joined them moments later, his hands wrapped in torn wool, his eyes scanning the sky as if expecting storms to gather above the hills, and he spoke of the coastal watchtowers, of the signal fires that would need to be maintained through snow and wind, of the archers who would have to learn to shoot in whiteouts, to track movement through blinding flurries, to hold the line when the ground itself turned against them. And Orhan listened to it all with the cold clarity of a man who had seen empires fall not to swords but to hunger, not to battles but to the slow erosion of hope. He turned to the map room as the afternoon light faded into the gray of early evening, the lamplight casting long shadows across the parchment that now bore the marks of coastal raids, tribal alliances, supply routes, and the creeping white of winter that would soon cover it all. And he stood at the head of the table with his commanders arrayed around him, their faces drawn but alert, their minds already turning to the next phase of a war that had shifted from open battle to a contest of endurance. Of logistics, of will. Ebrenos brought intelligence from the captured documents and the coastal scouts, revealing that the emperor's fleet had not withdrawn to Constantinople but had anchored in the deeper bays beyond the reach of Ottoman archers, their ships forming a floating blockade that would intercept any merchant vessel daring to slip through the straits, their commanders ordered to wait out the winter, to let the cold and the hunger do what steel and fire could not. To turn the people's loyalty into a commodity bought with bread rather than one with banners. Orhan traced the coastline with his finger, following the routes of the imperial supply ships, the hidden coves where merchant vessels might slip through, the mountain trails that could carry grain and salt from the eastern territories if the passes remained open, and he spoke with the quiet certainty that had become his hallmark. "We will not wait for winter to choke us," he said. "We will break the blockade before the first heavy snow seals the valleys. We will send raiding parties to the imperial supply depots along the coast. We will secure the hidden trading routes through the southern hills, and we will make the emperor's fleet fear the waters they seek to control." Tarhin's eyes lit with the familiar fire of a man who preferred action to waiting, and he volunteered to lead the southern strike, while Shamil agreed to reorganize the coastal defenses into a mobile network of hit-and-run units that would harass any ship that dared approach the shore, their arrows tipped with fire, their blades sharp, their movements silent as snowfall. Esporcha stepped forward, her voice clear and steady, and she told the council that she would ride with Tarhin, that her knowledge of the coastal terrain and her experience in close combat would be essential in the raids that would follow. And Orhan looked at her and saw not a woman seeking glory but a warrior who understood that the realm's survival depended on those willing to stand in the dark and strike first. Nilufer, who had been listening quietly from the edge of the room, spoke then, her voice soft but carrying the weight of the city's heart, and she promised that the granaries would be rationed wisely, that the markets would be kept open, that the people would be told the truth without fear, and that the palace would become a beacon of order in a time that demanded it. Malhattan added that the inner corridors would be sealed against the cold, that the hearths would be kept burning, that the wounded would be tended, that the realm would not fracture under the weight of winter because the women who held its center had learned to forge strength from stillness. The plan was set in motion with the swift precision of a machine forged in repeated trials, and as the night deepened, Orhan found himself once more in the underground chamber where Andreas and Faladios waited in the damp silence, their chains rattling softly as they shifted on the stone floor, their faces pale in the torchlight, their eyes reflecting the slow erosion of men who had believed themselves untouchable. Orhan did not speak at first, he simply stood before them, letting the weight of his presence fill the space, and then he told them that the depot had been burned, that the grain had been secured, that the tribes had stood firm, that the realm would not starve, and that their emperor's loom was unraveling thread by thread. Faladios smiled faintly, the expression bitter and knowing, and he replied that the sea was vast and the emperor's patience was longer than any sultan's reign, that the blockade was only the first layer of a siege that would be measured in seasons rather than days, and that when the winter came and the passes closed and the granaries emptied, the people of Bursa would turn on their own, that loyalty was a luxury that hunger stripped away. Andreas remained silent, his gaze fixed on the wall, his pride broken but his mind still working, still calculating, still waiting for the moment when the wheel would turn again. Orhan left them to the dark and climbed the stairs to the palace corridors, where the air was warm with the scent of pine resin and the quiet murmur of servants preparing for the night, and he walked to the inner chambers where Nilüfer and Asporça had gathered to review the supply lists, their heads bent over parchment, their hands moving quickly as they calculated rations, medical stores, and the distribution of winter cloaks to the garrisons. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, feeling the strange and profound gratitude of a man who had been given not just warriors but partners in the work of survival, and when Nilüfer looked up and saw him, her eyes softened, and she asked if the council had yielded a path forward. He told her of the raids, of the southern strike, of the need to move quickly before the weather turned, and Asporça nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger, her voice quiet but firm as she said that the raiding parties would leave at first light, that they would travel light and fast, that they would strike the supply depots and return before the imperial scouts could react. Nilüfer reached out and touched Orhan's arm, her fingers warm against the cold steel of his bracer, and she told him that the city would hold, that the people would endure, that he must ride with the knowledge that his absence would not leave them vulnerable, but would instead be the reason they remained strong. The night passed in the quiet rhythm of preparation, the stables echoing with the sound of hooves on stone, the armories ringing with the sharpening of blades, the kitchens baking bread for the road, and as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern hills, the raiding force assembled in the courtyard, their horses saddled, their cloaks fastened, their faces set with the grim determination of men and women who knew that the war had entered a new phase. One fought not in open fields but in the shadows of supply lines and the cold winds of approaching winter. Orhan mounted Karanlik, the great stallion snorting in the chill air, and he looked out over the assembled riders, his eyes meeting those of Tarih, of Asporça, of the commanders who had bled with him, and he spoke without raising his voice, his words carrying across the courtyard like a promise. "We ride to break the chain," he said. "We ride to feed our people. We ride to show the emperor that his sea cannot starve us, that his winter cannot freeze us, that his empire cannot outlast our will." And with that the gates opened, and the force rode out into the gray morning, leaving behind the city that had held, the walls that had stood, the hearts that had not broken. The journey south took them through terrain that grew rougher with each passing mile, the rolling hills giving way to steep ravines and dense pine forests where the wind howled through the branches and the ground was slick with frost, the air biting at their faces, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. They moved in silence, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth, their eyes scanning the tree lines for any sign of imperial scouts or hidden patrols, their hands resting on their weapons, their minds sharp with the knowledge that the enemy's agents would be watching, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. On the third day, as they approached the coastal ridge that overlooked the imperial supply depot at Varna, Tarih called a halt and the force dismounted, spreading out along the crest to survey the valley below. The depot was a sprawling complex of wooden warehouses and stone storehouses, surrounded by a low wall and guarded by a contingent of imperial infantry and a small detachment of heavy cavalry, their banners snapping in the wind, their watchfires burning bright against the gray sky. The layout was familiar to Orhan, the same pattern he had seen in the captured documents, the same vulnerabilities he had traced on the map, and he turned to Tarih and Asporça and laid out the plan in quiet, precise terms. It would strike at dusk, when the guards changed shifts and the light was fading, when the watchfires would cast long shadows and the wind would mask the sound of their approach. Tarih would take the eastern flank with 50 riders, circling around the ridge to cut off the retreat and prevent reinforcements from arriving, while Asporça would lead a smaller unit through the dry riverbed that ran beneath the depot's walls, slipping past the outer sentries and setting fire to the eastern warehouses to create confusion. Orhan himself would lead the main force through the northern tree line, striking the main gate with speed and precision, overwhelming the guards before they could raise the alarm and securing the grain and salt stores for transport back to Bursa. The plan was risky, relying on timing and silence rather than brute force, but it was the only way to strike deep and withdraw before the Imperial fleet could respond. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, the riders moved into position, their cloaks blending with the shadows, their breath visible in the cold air, their hearts beating in the steady rhythm of men who had done this before and would do it again. Dusk fell like a curtain, and the depot's watchfires burned brighter, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls, the guards moving through their routines with the weary efficiency of men who had grown accustomed to the quiet of the coast, unaware that the darkness was already filling with the silent shapes of riders who had come to take what the Emperor thought was his. Esporcha slipped into the riverbed first, her unit moving like water through the narrow channel, the sound of the wind masking their footsteps, the cold mud clinging to their boots, and when they reached the eastern wall, they scaled it with ropes and grappling hooks, dropping silently into the courtyard where the first warehouse stood, its doors heavy with iron, its roof thatched with dry straw. Esporcha gave the signal and the fire was set, the flames catching quickly, licking up the walls, sending sparks into the night sky, and within moments the alarm was raised, the guards shouting, the bells ringing, the heavy cavalry scrambling to mount their horses, their confusion turning to panic as the fire spread to the adjacent storehouses, the heat driving them back, the smoke filling the courtyard, turning the night into a choking haze. Tarhin's force struck from the east at the same moment, their riders bursting from the tree line with a roar that echoed off the hills, their blades flashing in the firelight, their charge hitting the Imperial cavalry before they could form a line, the impact sending men and horses sprawling, the ground shaking with the force of the collision, and the eastern flank became a whirlwind of steel and fire, the Imperial guards fighting desperately but outmatched. Their formation breaking under the relentless pressure of riders who knew how to strike and withdraw, how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to turn chaos into a weapon. Orhan led the northern assault, his force moving through the trees with the silent precision of hunters, their arrows loosed into the watchtowers, their blades cutting through the outer guards before they could raise the alarm, and when they reached the main gate it was already buckling under the weight of the fire and the panic inside, and Orhan gave the order to breach, the heavy timber splintering under the blows of axes and rams, the gate falling inward with a crash that echoed across the valley. And the Ottoman riders poured into the depot like a flood, their swords working in tight, efficient arcs, their voices rising in the war cry that had become the sound of the realm's defiance. The fight was brutal and intimate, the kind of close combat where the world shrank to the space between two blades, where the heat of the fire mixed with the cold of the night, where the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood and iron, and Orhan moved through it with the calm focus of a man who had learned to fight not with rage but with purpose, his blade parrying, thrusting, cutting, his eyes scanning for the commander, for the moment when the resistance would break. He found him near the central storehouse, a broad-shouldered officer in imperial armor, his sword raised, his face twisted with the fury of a man who had been caught unprepared, and the two men clashed in a duel that was less about skill and more about will, steel ringing against steel, sparks flying, boots slipping on the ash-covered ground, and Orhan felt the familiar rhythm of combat, the give and take, the feint and counter, the moment when the enemy's guard dropped and the blade found its mark. The officer fell, his armor clattering against the stone, and the remaining guards, seeing their leader down, threw down their weapons or fled into the burning warehouses, their resistance crumbling like dry earth under a heavy rain. Orhan ordered the stores secured, the grain and salt loaded onto the captured wagons, the horses fed and watered, and as the fire spread through the depot, turning the imperial supply into ash and smoke, he stood on the ridge and watched the flames consume what had been meant to starve his people, feeling the strange and quiet satisfaction of a man who had turned the enemy's weapon against them. Tarhin rode up beside him, his face streaked with soot, his eyes bright with the firelight, and he reported that the eastern flank was clear, that the Imperial cavalry had been scattered, that the retreat route was open, and Esporcha joined them moments later, her cloak singed at the edges, her blade still dripping with the ash of the night, and she told Orhan that the eastern warehouses were fully consumed, that the guards had fled, that the depot was theirs. They loaded the wagons, secured the prisoners, and began the march back to the ridge, the fire lighting their path, the wind carrying the scent of victory and loss in equal measure. And as they rode into the darkness, the depot burning behind them like a beacon of defiance, Orhan felt the wheel turn once more, slow and inexorable, carrying them toward the next challenge, the next battle. The next moment when the choices made by a sultan and the people who stood with him would shape the destiny of a realm that refused to break. The return journey was made in the cold hours before dawn, the wagons heavy with grain, the horses moving steadily through the frost-covered trails, the riders silent but alert, their eyes scanning the tree lines for any sign of pursuit, their hands resting on their weapons, their minds already turning to the next phase of the war. They reached the highland passes as the first light touched the peaks, the snow beginning to fall in soft, silent flakes that settled on their cloaks and the horses' manes, the air growing colder with each passing hour, and Orhan knew that the winter had arrived, that the blockade would tighten, that the emperor's patience would be tested by the same cold that now gripped the mountains, and he felt the weight of the seasons settle over him. The knowledge that the war would not end with a single victory but would be fought through snow and ice and hunger, through whispered doubts and steadfast loyalty, through the quiet courage of those who chose to stand when the world grew dark. He rode into Bursa as the snow fell heavier, the city gates opening to receive the returning force, the people gathering in the streets to watch the wagons roll through, their faces alight with the quiet joy of survival, their hands raised in blessing, their voices rising in prayers of gratitude, and Orhan felt the strange and profound humility of a man who had been given not just a victory, but a chance to prove that the realm could endure. That the bonds forged in fire and loyalty could withstand the cold of winter, that the wheel would keep turning, carrying them forward through storm and snow and shadow, toward the dawn that would come again as it always did for those who refused to yield. And somewhere beyond the sea, in the cold halls of Constantinople, the emperor sat in silence as the news of the depot's destruction reached him, his face unreadable, his hands resting on the arms of his throne, his mind already turning to the next move, the next thread in the loom, the next storm he would send across the water, because the pride of empire could not tolerate the existence of a realm that had defied it and survived, and the war would continue as wars always did. Not with the clean resolution of Thales, but with the messy, complicated, deeply human reality of a world where victory was never final and defeat was never the end, where the bonds between people were tested by every passing storm and strengthened or broken by the choices made in the quiet moments between battles. And Orhan Sahib stood at his window and watched the snow fall and breathed and prepared, knowing that the wheel would turn again, and again and again. Until the last breath left his body, and his name was carved into the earth that had given him everything. The silence that followed victory was never truly silence. It was merely the absence of war drums, filled instead by the quieter sounds of a realm counting its wounds. In the days after the imperial fleet retreated beyond the horizon, Bursa became a city of bandages and burn salves, of widows standing at doorways with shawls pulled tight against the sea wind, of blacksmiths hammering replacement blades while the old ones, notched and blunted, were melted down for the bronze and iron they still held. The beach where Tarhin's cavalry had broken the landing remained a graveyard of charred timber and rusting mail, the tide depositing new debris each morning, splintered oars, leather sandals, broken helmets, once the possessions of men who had believed the emperor's promise that the Ottoman frontier would fold like parchment. Orhan walked that shore on the third morning after the battle, not in ceremony, but in the private reckoning that victory demanded of those who commanded it. He moved among the burial details, his boots sinking into sand darkened by ash and blood, and he stopped when a young soldier, barely more than a boy, lifted a body from the surf and began to weep because the dead man's face was his elder brother. Orhan did not offer words. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and stood with him until the weeping subsided, and then he helped lift the body onto the cart himself. This was the mathematics that no map captured. One brother saved the realm and the other carried him home. In the palace, the work of survival continued with the relentless pace of a grinding wheel. Nilofer had transformed the eastern wing into a house of healing, every chamber filled with pallets, every corridor smelling of boiled herbs and vinegar, every window open to the salt air because the physicians said it slowed the rot in wounded limbs. She moved through this world with a calm that frightened those who did not know her, changing bandages, holding hands, reading verses to men whose eyes were glazed with fever. Malhattan managed the city's stores with an iron grip, refusing to release grain for celebration until the reserves were counted 3 times over, because she understood that a victory feast in autumn could become a famine winter if the emperor chose to blockade rather than invade. Esporcha rode each dawn to the coastal fortifications, inspecting the repairs, testing the new watch rotations, her eyes searching the sea as if she could see through the curve of the earth to the harbors where the enemy licked his wounds and sharpened his claws. And in the lowest chamber of the palace, where the torchlight never quite reached the corners, Faladios waited. He had been moved from his first cell to a deeper one, carved from bedrock beneath the oldest foundations, a room where sound died and time became theoretical. The wound in his shoulder had healed to a pink scar, thanks to the ministrations of a physician who reported daily that the prisoner was cooperative, polite, and unnervingly grateful for each cup of water, but the mind inside that chamber had not grown docile. Orhan visited him on the 7th evening after the battle, descending the stone stairs with Shamil and 2 guards, the air growing colder with each step until breath became visible. Faladios sat on his narrow bench, dressed now in plain wool rather than the fine silks of his capture, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had been expecting company. "The emperor is angry," Faladios said before Orhan could speak. He did not ask about the battle, he did not need to. The sounds of celebration drifting through the palace vents above had told him everything. But anger, Faladios continued, is not a strategy. It is a weather pattern, and weather passes. Orhan stood before him, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch until it became a pressure. Faladios smiled faintly and added that the emperor had sent fleets before that had failed, that Constantinople had swallowed defeats larger than this and remained eternal, that the difference between an empire and a frontier state was the empire's capacity to absorb loss and return with greater force. He spoke as if he were still an advisor at court, not a prisoner in chains, and the smoothness of his voice was itself a weapon, designed to make Orhan feel the weight of an enemy that could not be killed by a single battle. Orhan replied that empires also had memories and that memories could become shackles. He placed on the stone bench between them a single object, the imperial seal taken from the false priest at St. Michael, recovered from the evidence stores where it had waited like a sleeping snake. Faladios looked at it, and for the first time since his capture, something flickered in his eyes that might have been pain. Orhan told him that the seal had been copied, that false letters bearing its impression were already traveling westward toward Constantinople, letters suggesting that Faladios had not been captured but had defected, that he had given up the coastal network in exchange for Ottoman gold and a promise of land. The accusation was a lie, but lies told with evidence could outrun truth, especially in a court where suspicion was already a currency more valuable than gold. Faladios's composure cracked, not dramatically, but in the way a fine porcelain cup develops a hairline fracture. He said that Orhan played a dangerous game, that poisoning an enemy's court with falsehood was a blade that cut both ways. Orhan answered that he had learned the technique from a master and that the student sometimes surpassed the teacher. He left the seal on the bench and ascended the stairs without looking back, but he knew that the seed had been planted. Faladios would now spend his imprisonment not merely planning escape, but wondering whether the world he wished to return to still believed him loyal. It was a small cruelty, but war was made of small cruelties stacked upon one another until they became walls. Above ground, the season was turning. The olive harvest had begun in the outer groves, the first frost had silvered the highland passes, and the shepherds were driving their flocks down from the summer pastures to the winter valleys. Korkut sent word from the mountains that the passes were secure, that Dragon's gold had found no takers among the tribal councils, but that strange riders had been seen in the eastern foothills, men who wore no colors and asked no questions, watching the trails rather than traveling them. Orhan read the message by firelight and understood that the emperor had shifted his gaze from the sea to the land, from the frontal assault to the patient siege, from iron dawn to the long winter knife. The first sign of that knife came not from the east, but from within. A merchant named Theodoros, who had traded wool and wine in Bursa's market for 15 years without drawing attention, was found dead in his warehouse on a morning when the mist lay thick enough to swallow sound. His throat had been cut with professional precision, left to right, the mark of a left-handed blade wielded by someone who knew that a man's blood would pump longest if the heart was struck from that angle. Beside his body lay a ledger that had been burned almost entirely, save for one page that had fluttered beneath a crate, a list of names, some crossed out, others marked with a symbol that Eunice recognized immediately as the old imperial quartermaster's mark. Theodoros had been a paymaster, a node in the network that funneled gold to agents and sympathizers, and his death meant one of two things. Either the Ottomans had finally traced him and he had been silenced before capture, or the network was being cleaned from within, old connections severed to protect new ones. Orhan stood over the body in the warehouse, the smell of burned paper and coppery blood mixing with the scent of raw wool, and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when the enemy changed shape. He ordered Abrenos to take the surviving names and cross-reference them with every captured document, every interrogation, every whispered rumor that had passed through the palace in the last year. He ordered a Sportia to double the guard on Faladios, not because he believed the prisoner had orchestrated the killing, but because the timing suggested someone wanted attention drawn away from the deeper currents. And he ordered Tarih to prepare a mounted patrol to ride the winter roads, because if the emperor's gold was still moving, it was moving toward men who would sell the realm piece by piece as the cold deepened. The investigation consumed 10 days. On the 11th, Abrenos came to the council chamber with a face gray from lack of sleep and a sheaf of papers that trembled slightly in his hands. The names from Theodoros's ledger connected to 3 officers in the city guard, 2 minor clerics in the mosque administration, and one figure that made Orhan's blood run cold, a captain of the grain convoys, a man named Hassan, who controlled the movement of food from the southern storehouses to the city. If Hassan was compromised, the entire supply system was vulnerable. A single poisoned granary, a single delayed shipment during a winter siege, and Bursa would begin to starve from within while the enemy waited beyond the walls. Hassan was taken at dawn, dragged from his bed in the convoy barracks before he could reach the knife hidden beneath his pillow. Under questioning by Shamil, he broke faster than a man of his position should have, confessing that he had been accepting gold for 6 months, passing information about convoy routes, schedules, and storage capacities to a courier who met him at the old Roman well south of the city. He claimed he did not know who the courier served, only that the pay was good and the questions seemed harmless until they were not. He wept, he begged, he offered to name others to serve as bait to do anything that would spare his family the shame of his treason. Orhan listened to the confession from behind a screen, his face unreadable, and when Shamil asked for the order, Orhan gave it with a voice that sounded like stone scraping against stone. Hassan would die. Not publicly, not with spectacle, but quietly, and his body would be buried without marker. The shame would be hidden to protect his family, but the death was necessary. Mercy to traitors was cruelty to the men who would starve because of them. But before the sentence could be carried out, a rider arrived from the southern watchtower with dust on his cloak and fear in his eyes. A column of smoke had been seen rising from the direction of the old Roman well. By the time Tarhin's men reached it, the courier was dead, his body sprawled beside the well with his own dagger in his chest, a note pinned to his cloak in Latin that read, "Loose threads bind no tapestry." The network was being cleaned again, and this time the cleaner was working faster than Ottoman justice could follow. Orhan understood then that he was facing not merely an external enemy, but an internal cancer that had metastasized during the long months of war. The emperor had planted seeds years ago, perhaps decades, cultivating men who did not know each other, who could not betray each other because they had never met, connected only by the gold that flowed through hands like Theodoros and the couriers who died before they could speak. To fight this, Orhan would need more than swords and watchtowers. He would need to turn the city itself into a weapon, every baker, every shepherd, every child in the street becoming eyes that watched for the stranger who asked too many questions, for the rider who traveled without dust, for the merchant who paid with coins that bore unfamiliar stamps. He called a gathering in the great square, not of soldiers and commanders, but of the people themselves. The square filled with the men and women of Bursa, their faces marked by the fatigue of a year spent under the shadow of war, their eyes wary but still holding the light of trust. Orhan stood before them not on a high platform but on the steps of the fountain at the square's center, so that he was among them rather than above them, and he spoke with a voice that carried to the edges without shouting. He told them about Theodoros, about Hassan, about the gold that moved in darkness to buy their hunger and their fear. He did not hide the danger. He told them that the emperor had lost at sea, and so now he sought to win from within, to make Bursa tear itself apart with suspicion before a single foreign soldier reached the gates. And then he told them that the only answer to such a war was not the silence of fear, but the voice of community, the willingness to know one's neighbor, to question the stranger, to protect the grain and the well and the road not because soldiers commanded it, but because the city belonged to them. A woman in the crowd, old enough to have buried 2 sons in previous wars, raised her voice and asked what they should do if they found a traitor in their own family. The square fell silent. Orhan looked at her and his answer came without hesitation. He told her that love for family and love for the realm were not enemies unless one made them so, that a traitor in the family saved no one by his treason, and that the greatest mercy was sometimes the truth spoken before the poison spread. He told them that he would not ask them to spy on each other, to whisper in corners, to live in the fear that every glance concealed a knife. Instead, he asked them to live openly, to speak clearly, to carry their loyalty like a torch that burned too bright for shadows to hide near it. If the enemy sought to make them suspicious of one another, then let their answer be trust so deep that suspicion found no purchase. The crowd did not cheer wildly. They murmured, they nodded, they looked at one another with a new kind of awareness, and when they dispersed, the city felt different, not safer exactly, but more awake. Merchants began to question unfamiliar customers. Children were taught to report riders who did not greet them. The old Roman well was filled in and a new one dug in the central square, watched by day and guarded by night. The grain stores were divided among 3 locations, each known only to a handful of men who had been chosen by Malhattan herself, their loyalty tested not by gold but by the history of their family's service. And slowly, like blood clotting in a wound, the internal bleeding began to slow. But the winter deepened, and with it came the news that the emperor had not spent the autumn licking his wounds in idle fury. A new army was gathering beyond the eastern mountains, not the mercenary rabble that had been thrown against the coastal cliffs, but the professional corps of the imperial tagmata, heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry who had conquered islands and broken rebellions from the Balkans to the Anatolian plateau. They were led by a general named Bardas Phocas, a name that carried weight even in the halls of Bursa, a soldier of the old school who had fought the Rus, the Bulgars, and the Arabs, a man who did not rely on Palladios's webs of deceit but on the cold arithmetic of siegecraft and maneuver. He was camped at Nicaea, the ancient city that lay like a dagger pointed at Bursa's heart, and his scouts were already probing the passes, testing the tribal defenses, measuring the ground where the spring campaign would begin. Orhan received this news in the deep of winter, snow falling against the palace windows, the fire in the hearth spitting sparks that died on the stone floor. He sat with Shamil, Tarhin, and Ebranos, the map of the eastern approaches spread before them like the skin of a flayed animal, and they traced the routes that Bardas would take. The direct road from Nicaea to Bursa ran through the narrow valley of the Nilufar River, a route that could be held by a small force if the heights were fortified, but which could be turned by any army willing to climb the snow-choked ridges to the north. The tribal cavalry, loyal now but untested against heavy imperial horse, would be the key. If they could harass the flanks, slow the baggage trains, and deny Bardas the forage his army needed, the imperial force might be weakened before it reached the plain. But if the tribes faltered, if the winter cold broke their will or their horses, then Bursa would face a siege by an army that knew how to build walls as well as break them. Tarhin argued for a preemptive strike, a winter raid against Nicaea itself, burning the imperial stores before Bardas could move. Shamil opposed it, pointing out that the mountain passes were already snowbound, that a force large enough to threaten Nicaea would starve on the march, and that a failed raid would prove to the tribes that Ottoman promises were hollow. Ebranos suggested a middle path, not a raid but a feint, a series of small attacks along the imperial supply lines that would force Bardas to disperse his forces to protect his rear, buying time for Bursa to prepare and for the spring thaw to bring the highland passes back into play. Orhan listened, his fingers tracing the line of the Nilufar on the map, feeling the terrain as if it were already beneath his boots. At last he spoke, and his voice was quiet but certain. He said that they would not wait behind walls, nor would they throw themselves at Nicaea in desperation. They would meet Bardas in the valley, but not in the valley's mouth where the imperial army could deploy its full strength. They would meet him in the narrows, where the river bent between cliffs and the road became a throat too tight for heavy cavalry to maneuver. They would fortify the heights in winter, stockpile stone for avalanches, and when Bardas came, they would show him that the Ottoman way of war was not the open clash of shield walls, but the patient crushing of an army that had been lured into a place where its strength became its weakness. The plan was set, and the winter became a season of labor rather than rest. Men climbed the frozen slopes above the Nilufar Valley, carrying timber and stone, building platforms for archers and rock slides, digging trenches that would channel the imperial infantry into killing grounds. The tribes, led by Korkut's younger son Tagin, sent riders who knew every goat path and hidden spring, their ponies sure-footed on ice that would break the legs of heavier horses. Shamil directed the work with the precision of a man building a machine of death, measuring angles of fire, calculating the weight of boulders needed to block a pass, timing the signals that would coordinate the ambush from both sides of the valley. And in the palace, as the snow piled against the walls and the days grew short, Orhan found moments of stillness that he had not known in months. He sat with Nilufar in the evenings, not speaking of war but of the small things that war tried to steal, the taste of honey from the southern hives, the sound of rain on the courtyard tiles, the memory of a spring day before the world had turned to iron. She told him that she was with child, the news delivered in a whisper that seemed to hang in the cold air like incense, and he held her with a gentleness that belied the hands that had killed men only weeks before. The child would be born in summer if the realm survived until summer, and the thought of that future became a fire in Orhan's chest brighter than any torch. Isporcha, when she learned of it, came to Nilufar not with jealousy but with a gift, a small dagger of patterned steel that she said was meant for the child's naming day, a weapon to grow into. The two women stood together in the chamber where the fire burned low, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of rivals, but of sisters bound by the knowledge that they were building a future together, stone by stone, breath by breath. Mal Hatun watched them from the doorway, her old eyes glistening, and she turned away before they could see her tears, because the mother of a sultan had learned that joy was most precious when it arrived unbidden in the midst of war. But joy was a fragile thing, and the enemy did not sleep. On the night of the winter solstice, when the darkness was longest and the fires burned highest to keep it at bay, the alarm sounded from the eastern wall. A patrol had found the body of a guard at the postern gate, his neck broken, his keys missing. The gate itself stood open, only a hand's width, but enough for a slim figure to pass. Orhan was roused from sleep by the clamor, and he reached the lower levels with sword in hand before his cloak was properly fastened. The guards were in disarray, torches blazing, voices echoing off stone. A count was taken. All prisoners were accounted for except one. Shahanshah was gone. The escape was a masterpiece of patience and timing. Shahanshah had not broken his chains, for they had been checked hourly. Instead, he had used the grease from his meals to slowly work the hinge of the cell door, a task that must have taken weeks of silent labor, his fingers bleeding in the darkness while the guards passed by unaware. The dead guard at the postern had been killed not by Shahansha, who was no assassin, but by someone who had been waiting, someone who knew the patrol routes and the exact moment when the solstice celebrations would draw eyes away from the walls. The open gate was a message as much as an escape route. It said that the enemy still had hands inside Bursa, hands that could reach into the palace itself and pluck a prisoner from beneath the sultan's roof. Orhan's rage was terrible in its silence. He ordered the city sealed, every gate closed, every rider stopped, every cart searched. But he knew, even as the orders flew, that Shahansha was already beyond the walls, riding toward Nicaea and the camp of Bardas Phokas, carrying with him every secret he had learned during his imprisonment. The location of the grain stores, the strength of the garrison, the state of the walls, the names of the commanders, and the knowledge that Nilufar was with child, a vulnerability that could be exploited to break the Sultan's will. Tarih wanted to pursue immediately, to ride through the night with 100 horses and drag Shahansha back by his hair. Orhan stopped him. He said that Shahansha was already gone, that the trail would be cold, and that to scatter forces in a winter chase was exactly what Bardas wanted. Instead, they would change everything that Shahansha knew. The grain stores would be moved. The garrison rotations would be altered, the walls would be reinforced at new points. And the child, when it came, would be protected by a security so tight that not even the wind would know its name. But the deeper wound was the knowledge that the enemy had reached inside the palace and touched what was most precious. Orhan stood in the empty cell. The quiet that followed the coastal victory was not the quiet of peace but the quiet of a drawn breath, the kind that settles over a battlefield when the last echo of steel has faded and the living are left to count what they have lost and what they have saved. Orhan Sahib stood once more at the palace window, the same stone ledge beneath his palms, the same horizon stretching out to where the sea met the sky, but the air had changed. The salt wind no longer carried the scent of burning ships and imperial ambition. It carried the damp chill of approaching autumn, the faint metallic tang of rain that had not yet fallen, and beneath it all, the heavy, unspoken truth that victory at the shore was only a reprieve, not an end. The emperor would not accept the broken fleet as a final answer. He would not send another wave of galleys to shatter against the same cliffs. He would adapt. He would turn his gaze inward, toward the veins that fed the realm, toward the roads and granaries and whispered alliances that kept Bursa alive, and he would strike where walls could not protect and swords could not reach. That truth arrived not with horns or banners, but with a single thread of smoke rising from the western granary in the dead of night. Orhan was awake before the alarm bells rang, his body already moving toward the door as the first shouts echoed through the courtyard, his boots striking stone in a rhythm that had been forged by years of sleeping with one eye open and one hand on steel. The fire was not wind-blown, it was deliberate. Oil had been poured along the support beams, the flames fed by dry timber and canvas, the heat already cracking the stone floor as guards dragged buckets and beat at the edges with wet cloaks. Shamal was there before Orhan arrived, his face grim in the firelight, his voice cutting through the chaos as he ordered the granary sealed, the surrounding buildings cleared, the water lines reinforced. But Orhan did not look at the flames. He looked at the ground, at the scuff marks in the dust. At the broken latch on the service door, at the way the fire had been placed to spread upward, not outward, to consume the stores rather than the walls. This was not sabotage born of panic. This was precision. This was a message. After the fire was contained and the last embers smothered beneath wet earth, the palace did not sleep. It shifted. Malhatun moved through the corridors with the quiet authority of a woman who had survived more sieges than most men had fought, her eyes missing nothing, her questions sharp and measured. Servants were questioned, guards were rotated, the armories were inspected. And beneath the floorboards of the eastern storehouse, where the dust had been disturbed only recently, they found it. A hollow space lined with waxed cloth containing sealed letters, ciphered ledgers, and a small iron seal stamped with a double-headed serpent coiled around a broken sword. The mark of the Vardar intelligence cell, a network thought dismantled a decade ago, now resurrected and operating in the shadows of the very palace that had sworn to root it out. The letters were not addressed to Constantinople. They were addressed to merchants, to caravan masters, to minor officials whose names appeared on supply manifests and tax rolls. The web had not been cut, it had been buried, and it was waiting for the signal to rise. Orhan held the seal in his palm, the metal cold against his skin, and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the cold clarity that came when the enemy shifted from open assault to silent rot. He called the council before dawn, the map room filled with men whose faces bore the exhaustion of weeks spent preparing for a war that had already changed shape. He laid the letters on the table, traced the roots with his finger, and spoke in a voice that carried no anger, only the weight of inevitability. The emperor has learned, he said. He will not send another fleet to break against our cliffs, he will starve us. He will turn our roads against us, our merchants into his eyes, our supplies into his weapons. And when the winter snows close the highland passes, when the tribes are isolated and the granaries run low, he will march on Bursa with an army that knows we are already bleeding. The room was silent. Tarhin's jaw tightened, Shamal's eyes narrowed. Ebrenos leaned forward, his voice low as he confirmed that caravan traffic along the southern trade routes had increased by nearly a third in the past month, that unfamiliar faces were appearing at the markets, that gold was changing hands in back alleys and quiet courtyards. The sleeper network was already moving, and if it was not cut at the root, it would strangle the realm from within. Then we do not wait for winter, Orhan said. We march now. We take the fight to the source, the Vardar Pass, the fortress that controls the river routes and the inland caravans. It is heavily guarded, its commander arrogant, his walls thick, his garrison confident after years of unchallenged dominance. But arrogance is a crack in stone, and cracks can be widened. We will strike before the snows fall. We will cut the supply lines at their throat. And we will make the emperor understand that his shadows cannot hide from the sun. The decision was made with the swiftness that marked Orhan's counsels, and as the morning light crept through the high windows, the preparations began. Tarhin would lead the vanguard, moving through the forest trails to avoid the main roads where imperial scouts might watch. Shamal would hold Bursa, reinforcing the gates, securing the wells, maintaining the illusion of normalcy while the true strength of the realm marched inland. Ebrenos would coordinate the intelligence network, tracking caravan movements, intercepting messages, feeding false reports to the sleeper cells to draw them out into the open. And Esporcha, who had stood beside Orhan through every raid and every council, who had proven her blade in the harbor and her voice in the highland camps, stepped forward and told him that she would ride with the strike force, not as a symbol but as a commander, her experience in close combat and forest warfare making her essential to the night assault that would decide the fate of the fortress. Orhan looked at her, saw the fire in her eyes and the steel in her posture, and nodded once, the gesture carrying the full weight of his trust. Nilüfer stood beside her, her hands clasped but her gaze steady, and she told Orhan that the palace would hold, that the women would keep the heart of the realm beating while the sword was drawn, and Malhatan added only a single word: return. They rode out as the sky turned from gray to bruised purple, the air thick with the promise of rain, the forest closing in around them like a living thing that remembered every footfall that had ever crossed its floor. The journey to Vardar was not a march but a hunt, moving through terrain that grew steeper and more treacherous with each passing mile, the pine forests thickening, the paths narrowing to single-file trails where a single misstep meant a fall into ravines that swallowed sound and light. They rode by day and rested by night, avoiding the main roads, moving through valleys where the mist clung to the trees like smoke from old fires, the psychological tension mounting with every league. Trust was no longer a given. Every shadow could hide a scout, every merchant could be a spy, every quiet village could be a listening post. Orhan felt it in the way his men spoke less, in the way their eyes scanned the tree line, in the way their hands never strayed far from their hilts. War had moved from the open field to the space between heartbeats, and in that space, doubt was as deadly as any blade. On the third night, as rain began to fall in steady sheets that turned the earth to mud and the air to a cold, damp weight, they reached the ridge overlooking the Vardar Pass. Below them, the fortress rose from the valley floor like a stone beast, its walls thick and high, its towers bristling with watchfires, its gates guarded by men in imperial livery whose armor gleamed even in the rain. Beyond the walls, the river cut through the valley, wide and fast, carrying barges loaded with grain and iron and the quiet wealth of an empire that believed itself untouchable. Orhan dismounted and lay flat on the wet earth, his eyes tracing the layout, the guard rotations, the blind spots where the walls met the cliffs, the old aqueduct that ran beneath the eastern gate, long abandoned but still structurally sound, its entrance hidden beneath a tangle of vines and fallen timber. He turned to Tarhin and spoke in a voice barely louder than the rain. We do not take the gates, we do not scale the walls, we go through the stone, we emerge inside, we open the gates from within, and we let the river carry the rest. The plan was laid out in whispers, each man memorizing his role, each movement calculated to the second. Tarhin would feint at the southern gate with a small force, drawing the garrison's attention, creating chaos, forcing the commander to commit his reserves. Shamal's reserves, held back at the ridge, would strike if the feint turned into a trap. Orhan would lead the assault team through the aqueduct, 20 men in total, moving in silence, blades wrapped, boots muffled, hearts steady. Esporcha would command the archers on the western ridge, covering the retreat, picking off sentries, ensuring the escape route remained open if the walls closed around them. It was a plan that relied on precision, on timing, on the kind of trust that could only be forged in the crucible of repeated danger, and as the rain fell and the night deepened, they moved. The aqueduct entrance was a mouth of darkness, the air inside cold and damp, the stone slick with centuries of runoff and moss. Orhan led the way, his hand on the wall, his breathing controlled, his mind mapping every step, every turn, every echo. The men followed in single file, their presence a whisper in the dark, their swords held low, their eyes adjusting to the gloom. The tunnel sloped downward, then upward, the sound of the river growing louder, the smell of wet stone and old iron filling the air. They emerged into a narrow chamber beneath the eastern gate, the ceiling low, the floor uneven, the exit blocked by a rusted iron grate that had not been opened in decades. Tarhin's men had already positioned themselves above, waiting for the signal. Orhan placed his hands on the grate and pushed. It groaned, shifted, gave way with a sound like a dying breath. They slipped through into the courtyard, the rain still falling, the watchfires casting long, flickering shadows across the stone. The first sentry fell without a sound, Shammel's blade sliding between ribs as the man turned a corner, his body lowered gently to the ground and dragged into the shadows. Two more followed in quick succession, their throats cut in the dim light of wall sconces, their weapons taken and hidden. The courtyard was empty, the garrison focused on the southern gate where Tarhin's feint had already begun, the sound of shouting and clashing steel echoing through the rain. Orhan moved toward the gatehouse, his men fanning out, their movements precise, their silence absolute. They reached the heavy wooden doors, the iron bars still in place, the guards inside unaware of the death that had already slipped beneath their feet. Orhan placed his hand on the bar, felt the weight of it, the cold iron against his palm, and he pushed. The doors groaned, the bar shifted, and then with a sound that cut through the rain like a blade, the gates swung open. Tarhin's force poured through, their horses splashing through the mud, their blades drawn, their voices rising in the war cry that had become the signature of the realm's defenders. The garrison, caught between the southern feint and the sudden breach, scrambled to form a line, but the chaos was already too deep, the confusion too absolute. Steel rang against steel, men fell, horses screamed. The courtyard became a storm of fire and blood, the rain mixing with the smoke of overturned torches, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and iron. Orhan fought at the center of it, his sword moving with the mechanical precision of a man who had faced death too many times to fear it, his strikes economical, his movements controlled, his mind already tracking the commander's position, the man who had built his confidence on thick walls and unchallenged dominance. He found him on the upper ramparts, a broad-shouldered veteran in polished armor, his sword drawn, his face twisted with fury as he watched his fortress fall apart around him. The duel was not long, but it was brutal, the rain making the stones slick, the wind carrying the smoke of burning tents, the sound of battle echoing off the walls like a drumbeat. The commander fought with the desperation of a man who knew his pride was his undoing, his strikes heavy, his footwork clumsy, his breath ragged. Orhan fought with the calm of a man who had already accepted the cost, his blade parrying, deflecting, advancing, driving the commander back step by step until the edge of the rampart met his boots. The final strike was not a flourish but a necessity, the sword sliding through the gap in the armor, the commander's eyes widening, his body falling backward into the rain, the sound of his impact lost in the roar of the collapsing garrison. The fortress fell by dawn, the river routes were cut, the supply lines severed, the imperial network in the past dismantled, but the victory was not clean, it never was. The courtyard was strewn with the dead, the walls scarred by fire, the air heavy with the weight of what had been taken and what had been given. Orhan stood at the center of it, his sword dripping, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the faces of his men, counting the living, mourning the fallen. Esporcha rode up beside him, her cloak soaked, her blade still drawn, her face marked with the grime of battle but her eyes clear, and she told him that the archers had held the ridge, that the retreat route was secure, that the men had fought like lions and bled like brothers. Tarhin arrived moments later, his armor dented, his face streaked with sweat and rain, and he told him that the commander's ledgers had been found, that the imperial supply schedule was now in their hands, that the winter march would be delayed, perhaps halted entirely, if the river routes remained cut. Orhan nodded, his voice rough as he ordered the wounded tended, the prisoners secured, the fortress stripped of its stores before it was set ablaze. They would not hold Vardar, it was too deep in enemy territory, too far from Bursa, too vulnerable to counterattack. But they would leave it broken, its walls scarred, its gates shattered, its river routes choked with the debris of imperial ambition. And as the fire took the fortress, as the smoke rose into the gray sky, as the rain washed the blood from the stones, Orhan felt the familiar weight settle over him, the knowledge that every victory carried the seed of the next challenge, every battle won only delayed the inevitable, every life spent only bought time for the realm to breathe. They rode back through the forest as the sky darkened once more, the rain giving way to a cold wind that carried the scent of pine and ash, the men moving in silence, their faces drawn, their hands resting on their hilts. The psychological tension had not lifted, it had shifted. The emperor would not send another fleet, he would not march another army through the passes, he would adapt. He would strike where they least expected, where the walls were thin, where the trust was fragile, where the heart of the realm beat closest to the surface, and Orhan knew it. He felt it in the way the wind moved through the trees, in the way the shadows lengthened, in the way the night seemed to hold its breath. When they reached Bursa, the gates opened without ceremony. the guards stepping aside with eyes that carried the quiet relief of men who had feared the worst and found their sultan still standing. Malhattan met them at the steps, her face composed but her eyes carrying the shadow of days spent in vigilance, and she told him that the palace had held that the granaries were secure, that the sleeper cells had been flushed from the markets, their ledgers burned, their networks dismantled. Nilüfer stood beside her, her hands clasped, her gaze steady, and she told him that the women had kept the heart of the realm beating, that the people had not broken, that the alliance between the Highland tribes and the Ottoman house had held firm even as the snows began to gather on the distant peaks. Esportia embraced them both, a gesture that spoke of bonds forged in fire and tested by doubt, and Orhan felt something tighten in his chest, the quiet understanding that the realm was not held by walls or swords or strategies, but by the people who chose to stand when the shadows lengthened and the night grew cold. That evening, as the fires burned low and the palace settled into a watchful quiet, Orhan walked the corridors alone, his thoughts moving through the tunnels of Vardar, the rain on the stones, the commander's final breath, the faces of the men who had not returned. He stopped at the window where so many moments had unfolded, and he looked out over the city, the lights of homes and the distant fires of camps, the realm that demanded everything and gave back only the chance to fight another day. The sea was calm. The mountains were quiet, the winter was coming. And somewhere beyond the horizon in the cold halls of Constantinople, the emperor sat in silence, his rage cooling into calculation, his mind already weaving the next thread, already preparing the next choice, already understanding that the Sultan of Bursa was not a man to be broken by force but a force to be understood, outmaneuvered, and ultimately, if possible, turned against himself. Orhan placed his hand on the stone and closed his eyes, and in the silence of the night he felt the wheel turn once more, slow and inexorable, carrying them toward the next chapter, the next challenge, the next moment when the choices made by a sultan and the people who loved him would shape the destiny of nations. The fire in the hearth burned low. The smoke rose in thin spirals. The wind moved through the olive groves like a whisper of things yet to come. And the story continued, as stories always did, not with the clean resolution of a tale told to children, but with the messy, complicated, deeply human reality of a world where victory was never final and defeat was never the end, where the bonds between people were tested by every passing storm and strengthened or broken by the choices made in the quiet moments between battles. Orhan Sahib stood at his window and breathed, and the night embraced him, and the wheel turned, and the realm endured, waiting for the dawn that would bring new challenges and new chances to prove that the light of loyalty and courage could not be extinguished by the shadows of empire. The silence that followed the coastal victory was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a drawn blade held motionless before the strike, the hush that falls between the lightning and the thunder when the storm has not passed but has only gathered its breath for the greater roar. In Bursa, the people celebrated with the desperate joy of those who had looked into the abyss and seen it recede, but in the palace, where the maps were spread beneath lamps that burned through the night, the commanders understood what the common celebrants did not, that the emperor's fleet had been bloodied, not broken, and that a man who commanded the wealth of Constantinople could build 10 fleets for everyone that burned. The wreckage on the shore was a message, yes, but it was a message that would travel across the water and arrive in the imperial court not as a warning to retreat, but as a wound that demanded vengeance measured in armies. Orhan Sahib stood in the council chamber as the last of the commanders filed out, their boots heavy with exhaustion, their faces lined with the particular weariness that comes not from one battle, but from the knowledge that the war has become a living thing, a fire that feeds on every attempt to extinguish it. He remained alone with the maps, his fingers tracing the coastline where the blackened hulls still smoldered, then moving inland to the eastern passes where Korkut's tribe stood watch, then south to the roads that led toward the distant shadow of Constantinople itself. The realm had survived the first wave, the second would not come by sea alone. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the air tasted of copper and anticipation, in the silence of the prisoners below the palace where 3 men waited in stone rooms, each one a different kind of key to the enemy's mind. Faladios had not spoken since the battle, not a word. The guards reported that he sat in his windowless chamber with his hands folded, his wounded shoulder healing under the care of a physician who had been ordered to keep him alive but not comfortable, his eyes fixed on the flame of the single lamp as if he were reading prophecies in its dance. He ate what was given to him, he drank, he slept. But he did not speak, and that silence was more disturbing than any confession would have been, because it suggested that Faladios was not waiting to be saved, nor was he waiting to bargain. He was waiting for something to arrive, some signal, some shift in the board that only he could recognize. Andreas in the adjacent chamber had become the opposite. He raged. He cursed the guards in 3 languages. He demanded to see the emperor's envoy as if one might magically appear in the dungeon corridors. He threw his food against the walls and sang war songs from his homeland until his voice cracked, and then he wept, the tears of a man who had built his identity on the certainty of imperial victory and now found himself chained in the capital of the very realm he had sought to destroy. His mind was unraveling, and Orhan knew that an unraveling man could be useful, could let slip secrets in his fury that a composed man would bury forever. But he also knew that Andreas was becoming unpredictable, dangerous not as a strategist but as a wild animal in a cage, capable of biting even the hand that tried to feed him information. Shehansha sat in the quietest cell, neither raging nor calculating, but sinking into a melancholy that bordered on resignation. He wrote his letters when given parchment, spoke when questioned, and ate without appetite. The ambition that had driven him to Calavrai had been replaced by a hollow recognition that he had been used, that the throne he had reached for was not a throne at all but a stepping stone across a river of blood, and that the men who had promised him power had intended him to be washed away with the current. He was broken, but broken men could still be mended into weapons if the smith understood the metal. On the third night after the victory, as the city's bells still rang intermittently with the last echoes of celebration, Malhattan came to Orhan in the map room with a face that told him the peace had already cracked. She did not speak at first, but placed before him a small cloth bundle. Inside were 3 blue thread markers, the original imperial code, found not on a road or a tree, but inside the palace itself, tied to the latch of the grain storehouse door. Someone inside Bursa was still speaking to the enemy. Someone had walked through the streets that Orhan had bled to protect and had placed the marker where it would be found, a message or a signal, a thread connecting the heart of the realm to the web that Faladios had spun. Orhan looked at the threads and felt the old coldness settle behind his heart. He had believed the palace secure. He had believed that the capture of Faladios and the exposure of the network had severed the head of the serpent. But serpents did not have only one head. They had cells, fragments, true believers who needed no orders because they carried the cause in their blood. He ordered a lockdown, not announced, not visible, but a quiet tightening of the palace guard, a doubling of the watch on the prisoners, and a secret inventory of every servant, every messenger, every cook, every stable hand who had access to the inner corridors. Esporcha undertook the task with the methodical ruthlessness of a woman who understood that the enemy had once used her own jealousy as a weapon and would not permit another such opening. Nilufer worked beside her, the 2 women moving through the palace like shadows, comparing records, tracing movements, questioning with soft words and sharp eyes. They found discrepancies. A kitchen boy who had been hired 2 weeks before the battle and whose references led to a dead man. A washerwoman who carried messages to the outer market with unusual frequency. A guard on the night watch who had been seen speaking to a hooded figure near the eastern wall. None of them were the master spy. Each of them was a thread, and when pulled, they led not to Faladios directly, but to a name that made Orhan's hand tighten on his sword hilt, the physician who had been tending Faladios' wound. The man was brought before Orhan in the deep hours of the night, dragged from his chamber where vials of medicine still stood in rows like soldiers awaiting command. He was older, with gentle hands and a face that had soothed 1,000 fevers, and he looked at Orhan with eyes that held no fear, only a terrible calm that was worse than defiance. Under questioning, he admitted nothing at first, but when Esporcha placed before him the blue threads and the coated vials hidden in his medical chest, vials not of medicine but of the slow poison that had nearly taken Darsan's life, his composure cracked like thin ice. He had been planted years ago, he confessed, not by Faladios but by an older network, one that reached back to the court of Constantinople through channels so secret that even he knew only the name of his immediate handler, a monk in a coastal monastery who had died in the raids. He had tended Faladios not to heal him, but to prepare him, to keep him strong enough for the moment when the palace would be thrown into chaos by the emperor's assault and Faladios would be freed to take command of the hidden cells within the city. Orhan listened to the confession in silence, and when it was done, he ordered the physician held not executed, because a dead man could speak no more and because the network he represented might still have tendrils that could be traced. But he also ordered Faladios moved. The stone chamber was no longer secure enough. The prisoner was transferred to a tower room high above the palace, accessible only by a single stair, its windows narrow slits that faced the sea, its door reinforced with iron. He was stripped of everything but his clothes, given no implements, no furniture that could be broken into weapons, no shadows in which to hide messages. 4 guards watched him in rotating shifts, men chosen by Tarih personally, their loyalty tested in a dozen battles. And still, when Faladios was led up the stairs and pushed into the tower room, he turned to Orhan and smiled, a smile that held no defeat, only the patient amusement of a man who believed that time was on his side. "You build higher walls, Sultan," Faladios said, his voice echoing in the bare stone, "but walls are only useful if the enemy is outside them." Orhan looked at him through the iron grate and replied that some enemies were kept not because they were feared, but because they were specimens, reminders of what happened to those who mistook shadows for strength. Then he closed the door himself and walked down the long stair, the sound of his boots ringing like hammer blows against the stone. But the incident had shaken him more than he showed. If the physician had been planted years ago, then how many others slept in the city, waiting for the signal to wake? How many hands that served bread, that mended cloaks, that tended horses, carried the poison of foreign allegiance? The victory at the coast had made the realm feel safe, but safety was the most dangerous illusion of all. Orhan gathered his commanders and told them that the war was entering a new phase, one in which the battlefield was not the shore or the pass, but the mind of the city itself. They would root out the spies, yes, but they would also build something stronger than suspicion. They would build trust so visible, so undeniable, that the hidden enemies would find no cracks in which to plant their lies. To that end, he ordered a public court unlike any that Bursa had seen, not a court of judgment for the common prisoners, but a court of truth. The captured imperial documents were displayed, not as trophies, but as evidence, read aloud by scribes in the marketplace, so that every merchant, every farmer, every child could hear the words of the men who had sought to burn their homes. The false relic was paraded through the streets, its golden cloth stripped away, its bones shown to be ordinary, its accompanying letters of imperial authorization read to crowds that grew from hundreds to thousands. The people of Bursa saw with their own eyes that the holy war promised by the enemy was a merchant's trick, a stage play designed to make them kill their neighbors. And in that revelation, a subtle shift occurred. The fear that had made them vulnerable to rumor began to harden into a collective anger, not at the empire alone, but at the very idea of being manipulated. Nilüfer stood beside Orhan on the palace steps as the last of the documents was read, and she told him that the people were no longer merely subjects to be protected. They were becoming citizens who understood the stakes. Esporcha, watching from the edge of the crowd, saw a woman in the marketplace pick up a stone and hurl it at the platform where the false relic lay, not in desecration, but in fury at the lie it represented, and she knew that the enemy's greatest weapon had been turned. When the people could see the shape of deception, they became immune to its poison. Yet even as the city hardened, news arrived from the east that turned the celebration to ash in their mouths. Korkut was dead. The message came by exhausted rider, a young tribal warrior whose horse had died beneath him 2 miles from the gate and who had run the rest of the way on foot, his face streaked with tears and dust. He told the council that 3 days after the coastal battle, a delegation had arrived at the highland camps bearing the white flag of truce, claiming to be envoys from a neutral border lord seeking to negotiate safe passage for refugees. Korkut, ever the honorable elder, had agreed to parley under the sacred canopy where blood was forbidden. The envoys were not envoys. They were assassins, their white cloaks hiding blades coated with poison. Korkut had been struck down before the guards could react, and 2 other elders had fallen beside him. The assassins had been killed, but not before one had shouted that the emperor's mercy was a spear, and that those who rejected it would feel it in their hearts. The council chamber fell into a silence so complete that the sound of the wind against the shutters seemed like a scream. Orhan felt the blow physically, as if the poisoned blade had entered his own chest. Korkut had been more than an ally. He had been the bridge between the Ottoman house and the mountain tribes, the voice that had turned hesitation into resolve, the hand that had clasped Orhan's in the highland camp and sealed the alliance that had held the eastern passes. His death was not merely a murder. It was a message carved in flesh, a declaration that the emperor would no longer respect the boundaries of honor, that the rules of parley and sanctuary were as meaningless to him as the promises he had made to Shahanshah. The tribes were in uproar, the young warrior reported, divided between those who demanded immediate vengeance and those who feared that the assassination meant the emperor had agents even among the sacred guardians of the canopy. Orhan stood slowly from the table, his face pale, his hands flat against the wood to steady himself. He looked at the map, at the eastern passes now vulnerable to panic and division, and he understood that the war had changed again. The emperor had seen that he could not take Bursa by sea, could not break the tribes by gold, and so he had chosen terror. Terror did not need fleets. It needed only the willingness to strike where honor forbade, to kill where peace was promised, to turn the very sanctity of negotiation into a weapon of mass despair. Tarih slammed his fist on the table and swore that he would ride to the highlands and burn every village that had sheltered the assassins, every house, every field. Shamil, his own face hard with grief, said that vengeance without direction would only complete the enemy's work by turning the tribes against the Ottomans. Malhattan spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, and she said that Korkut's death must be answered not with fire but with the very thing the emperor sought to destroy, unity. If the tribes fractured, the assassins had won. If they held together, if the Ottomans stood beside them not as avengers but as brothers in mourning, then the poisoned blade would fail. Orhan listened, and in the space between their words, he made his decision. He would ride to the highlands himself, not with an army, not with the thunder of vengeance, but with the body of Korkut if it could be recovered, and with the full weight of his presence to stand before the tribal council and demand not war but solidarity. He would show them that the Ottoman Sultan mourned their elder as his own kin, that the bond between them was stronger than death, and that the emperor's terror was the last desperate weapon of a man who knew he could not win by force of arms alone. It was a terrible risk. The passes were dangerous, the tribes volatile, and the assassins might still be waiting. But Orhan knew that leadership was not merely the command of armies. It was the willingness to place oneself between grief and chaos, to absorb the blow that would otherwise shatter the fragile architecture of alliance. He departed before dawn, taking only 50 riders, a funeral escort rather than a war party, their banners draped in the dark cloth of mourning. Esporcha rode at his side, her presence a silent promise that the women of the Ottoman house would not hide behind walls while their men faced death. Nilüfer remained in Bursa, her hand clasping Orhan's at the gate, her eyes dry but her voice breaking only once as she told him that Korkut's spirit would guide him and that the realm would hold. Malhatun stood behind her, straight as a spear, and she whispered a prayer that was older than Islam, older than Christianity, a prayer to the earth itself to receive its son with honor. The ride to the highlands was the longest Orhan had ever taken. Every mile seemed to stretch into an eternity of grief and anticipation. The news of Korkut's death had traveled faster than the assassins could flee, and in the villages along the road, people stood in doorways with candles, their faces marked with the ashes of mourning, their silence a testament to the reach of the elders' influence. When the Ottoman column reached the first highland plateau, they were met not by warriors with drawn blades, but by a sea of white-clad mourners, the women of the tribes singing the old songs of lamentation that rose and fell like the wind across the grass, carrying Korkut's name into the mountains where his ancestors waited. The body had been prepared according to the ancient rites, washed in the cold streams, wrapped in the wool of his own flocks, placed upon a bier of pine branches in the center of the sacred canopy where he had died. The bloodstains were still visible on the earth, dark patches where the poison had mingled with the soil, and Orhan knelt beside them and placed his forehead against the ground, not as a sultan before his subjects, but as a son before his father. When he rose, his face was wet with tears that he did not try to hide, because in the highlands, grief was not weakness, it was the currency of truth. The tribal council had gathered, younger now, filled with men who had sat at Korkut's feet but had never wielded his authority, their faces torn between the desire for vengeance and the fear that vengeance would destroy them. Orhan stood before them and spoke not of strategy, not of the emperor's fleet or the coastal forts, but of Korkut, of the first time they had met, of the oath they had sworn, of the battles they had shared, of the way the old man had looked at him in the camp and chosen trust over gold. He told them that the assassins had struck not because they were strong, but because they were weak, that the emperor had sent poisoned blades because he could not send armies through the passes that Korkut had held. He told them that to answer this murder with division would be to hand the emperor the victory that all his fleets and gold could not buy. And then he made an offer that stunned the council into silence. He asked them to name Korkut's successor not from among their own elders alone, but from among the children of both the tribes and the Ottoman house, to create a bond of fosterage that would weave the two peoples together so tightly that no assassin's blade could sever it. He offered to send his own kin if the gods granted him children to be raised in the highland tents and to take their children into his palace so that the next generation would speak both tongues, pray to both skis, and carry the memory of Korkut in blood as well as in song. It was a radical proposal, one that touched the deepest nerves of tribal independence and Ottoman authority, and for a long moment the council simply stared at him. Then a woman stood from the edge of the gathering. She was old, her face carved with lines that spoke of loss and endurance, and she carried a staff topped with the carved head of a wolf. She was Korkut's sister, the last of his immediate blood, and she had not spoken since the murder. Now her voice rose, thin but unbreakable, and she said that her brother had died not for gold, not for empire, but for the belief that a man's word was the only immortality that mattered. She looked at Orhan and told him that she had expected the Sultan to come with fire, as conquerors always did. Instead, he had come with tears. That was the answer to the emperor's terror. Not more terror, but more tears, more truth, more bonds that could not be bought. She raised her staff and declared before the council that Korkut's spirit had chosen and that the alliance would hold. The younger men, still hungry for vengeance, looked at her and then at Orhan, and slowly, one by one, they knelt, not to the Sultan, not to the tribes, but to the earth beneath them and to the memory of the man who had taught them that the mountains were only as strong as the hands that held them together. The funeral lasted 3 days. On the third night, as the pyre burned and Korkut's ashes rose toward the stars, Orhan stood apart from the crowd with a sporcha at his side, and he told her that he had never felt so alone, even surrounded by thousands who claimed him as their own. She took his hand and said that loneliness was the price of the bridge he was building, that every man who sought to connect two worlds must stand in the space between them, exposed to the wind from both sides. She told him that she had lived in that space her entire life, between the court and the sword, between the woman she had been and the warrior she had become, and that she would stand there with him in the wind for as long as the earth allowed. They returned to Bursa as the Highland alliance solidified into something stronger than before, but the news that greeted them at the palace gate was like a blade waiting in the shadows. While Orhan had been in the mountains, the emperor had not been idle. A new army had landed on the southern coast, not the grand fleet of the first assault, but a smaller, harder force of veteran mercenaries and imperial marines, led by a general whose name was spoken in whispers even in Constantinople. Basil the Iron Hand, a man who had crushed rebellions in the Balkans and who was said to have built his reputation on the systematic destruction of everything that resisted him. He had taken a fishing village in a single night, put every man to the sword, burned the boats, and left the women as a message written in suffering. The message had been intended for Orhan. It was carved into the doorpost of the village's small church. The dawn comes for wolves. Orhan read the report in the map room, his face still bearing the marks of the Highland journey, his cloak smelling of wood smoke and funeral ash. He read it twice, then set it down with a gentleness that was more terrible than any outburst. Tarih, who had brought the news, watched him with the eyes of a man who knew the moment before the storm. Shamil stood by the window, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Malhatan and Nilüfer waited in the doorway, their faces pale. Orhan looked at them all, and his voice when it came was low, controlled, carrying the weight of a decision that had already been made. "We have defended," he said, "we have parried, we have absorbed the blows and buried our dead and held the walls, but Basil the Iron Hand does not understand defense. He understands only the boot and the torch. He will march north, burning every village, poisoning every well, leaving nothing behind him but ash, because he believes that if he makes the land worthless, we will have nothing left to fight for." He paused, and the silence in the room was absolute. "So we will not wait for him to come," Orhan continued. "We will take the war to him, not with the whole army, not with a grand invasion that would leave Bursa naked, but with a blade sharp enough to cut the head from the snake before it can coil. We will find his camp, his supply line, his arrogance, and we will show him that an army which leaves only ash behind it has no roots, and an army with no roots can be pulled from the earth." Tarhan's eyes blazed. Shamil nodded slowly, calculating. Malhatan stepped forward and asked the question that hung in the air: who would lead such a strike? Orhan looked at her, and then at Nilüfer, and then at Sporcha, and he said the words that would shape the next chapter of the war. "I will lead it, and I will not return until the emperor learns that the wolves of this land do not wait to be hunted. We hunt." The preparations began that night, not the slow gathering of armies but the swift, silent assembly of a killing force. 300 riders, the best of the cavalry, the hard men who had survived Juljaha and the coast and the marsh, led by Tarhan and Shamil and Sporcha with Orhan at their head. They would move south by hidden paths, traveling at night, striking supply wagons, burning the enemy's stores, and then vanishing before Basil could bring his heavy infantry to bear. It was a war of ghosts, of lightning, of the knife in the dark rather than the shield wall in the sun. And it was the only way to stop an enemy who had come not to conquer land, but to destroy the very idea of resistance. As the moon rose over Bursa on the night of their departure, Orhan stood once more at the palace gate, but this time it was Nilüfer who placed the cloth packet in his hand. The earth from Bursa's courtyard mixed now with ash from Korkut's pyre, and she told him that she carried his child. The word struck him like a thunderclap, and for a moment the commander vanished and only the man remained, staring at her with eyes that held the universe in their depths. She smiled through her tears and said that she had waited to tell him until he knew what he was fighting for, not just the realm, not just the memory of the dead, but the future that grew within her, the child who would inherit whatever world he built from the ashes of the old. Esporcha stood nearby, and she too stepped forward, and she placed her hand over Nilüfer's where it rested on Orhan's chest, and she said that she would ride with him, not as a rival, not as a shadow, but as the shield that would bring him back to see his child born. The three of them stood there in the moonlight, bound by a love that had been tested by poison and fire and war, and Malhatan watched from the steps with tears on her face that she did not bother to hide, because she had lived long enough to know that such moments were the only true victories in a world of endless conflict. Then Orhan mounted Karanlik, and the gate opened, and the wolves rode out into the darkness, not to defend but to hunt. Behind them Bursa stood tall, its walls lit by watchfires, its people holding their breath, its future hidden in the womb of a woman who had learned to be both gentle and steel. Ahead of them the land stretched south toward the sea, toward the fires of Basil the Iron Hand, toward the emperor's dream of a frontier broken and a realm brought to its knees. But the emperor had not yet learned the lesson that Arhan Sahib was riding south to teach him, that some realms were not built on stone or gold, but on the bones of those who refused to kneel, and that the wolves who ran through such nights were not beasts to be hunted, but spirits of the land itself, rising from the earth to defend what was theirs. The hoofbeats faded into the dark and the wheel turned and the war went on, but in the silence that followed, a new sound began to echo through the corridors of the palace, faint but unmistakable. The heartbeat of a child not yet born, drumming out the rhythm of a future that would be written not by emperors, but by the men and women who dared to stand between the fire and the ones they loved, and to say, with their last breath if necessary, not while I live.
Andreas rose from his chair, his face twisting with a mixture of fury and calculation, and he called for guards even as Arhan's men poured into the chamber from the corridor. Steel met steel in a clash that echoed through the stone halls. The fight contained at first to the room, bodies crashing against tables, scrolls scattering like fallen leaves. Arhan drove Andreas back against the wall, his blade at the man's throat, demanding the names, the roots, the full extent of the emperor's reach into Bursa's heart. Andreas laughed, a bitter sound, and told him that names were useless when the web was already woven, that even now Faladios was moving pieces that would force Arhan to choose between his realm and the women who held his soul. The door burst open again and imperial guards poured in, their numbers swelling the fight into chaos, and Arhan's men formed a defensive circle, their swords working in tight arcs as the room filled with smoke from an overturned lamp. Tarhin's group arrived from the western passage, their arrival turning the tide, and Shamel's force entered from the central hall, driving the remaining guards into retreat down the corridors. In the midst of the melee, Faladios appeared at the far doorway, his shoulder bandaged but his posture still elegant, his eyes meeting Arhan's across the chaos with a smile that held no warmth. He held a scroll in one hand and a small vial in the other, and he spoke over the din, his voice carrying like oil on water. "The choice is already made, Sultan," he called. "The letter you will receive in Bursa will tell you that your palace burns, that your women are taken, that only surrender will save them. Or perhaps the letter will be a lie, and you will never know until you return to ashes." Arhan surged toward him, cutting down a guard in his path, but Faladios dropped the vial and it shattered, releasing him. Night deepened into a velvet darkness broken only by the faint glow of distant lighthouses, and the occasional flash of phosphorescence in the water, a reminder that beauty and danger often shared the same skin. Arhan stood at the prow, his cloak whipping in the wind, his mind turning over the faces of those he had left behind and those he would face ahead. He thought of Yakid's final sneer, of Daphne's venomous laughter, of the way betrayal always came wearing the mask of friendship or loyalty until the moment it struck. He thought of the Emperor's distant hand moving pieces across a board where lives were pawns, of Andreas's ambition that had twisted a man into a tool, of Faladios's calm smile and the words he had spoken in the forest clearing about looms and threads and the killing power of choices. The crossing took the night and part of the following day, the galleys hugging the coastline to avoid the larger imperial patrols whose sails could be seen like white birds on the horizon. They slipped into a narrow inlet as the sun began to set on the second day, the water shallow and treacherous, the rocks rising sheer and dark. The men disembarked in silence, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, their weapons checked one final time under the cover of overhanging trees. Arhan led them upward along the cliff path, his hand on the stone for balance, the sea crashing far below like the breathing of a great beast that might wake at any moment and swallow them whole. The air smelled of salt and seaweed and the faint metallic tang of fear that no man admitted but every man carried. They reached the drainage tunnels as full darkness fell, the openings hidden behind a screen of vines and loose stones that the scouts cleared with careful hands. The tunnels were narrow, slick with moss and the drip of seawater, the air thick and cold, forcing the men to move in single file with torches shielded to the faintest glow.